Chapter 269. Sound Wave Attack. It was one of the most difficult attacks to defend against, and it was also the most troublesome attack for rogues. Whether it was the melee profession's Berserk Roar, War Roar, Fear Roar, or the spellcaster profession's Roar, Infrasonic Wave, Banshee's Howl, etc., these attacks were all difficult to defend against with conventional means. Unless it was a spell that protected against sound wave attack, there was only one key to determining whether you could survive this attack, and that was whether your fortitude was enough to pass many tests. As for sound wave attacks, many were like various versions of Lion Roar, and there were few ways to defend against them. Even spellcasters would still stumble on this. As soon as the distance was shortened, it was almost impossible to pass the test of fortitude by relying on the weak constitution of the spellcaster without a spell in advance. In fact, at this moment, even Soren could not completely pass the test of fortitude. The sound waves of the roar made him dizzy, as if a cannonball had exploded directly beside him, and the shock wave made his eardrums bleed. Although he did not faint, Soren's current state was also very bad. He almost had no time to dodge the bear spirit's attack, and was directly slapped 7 or 8 meters away. Plop. Soren's figure landed on the ground, his chest was slightly sunken, and 7 or 8 of his ribs were broken. If it wasn't for the protective energy of stone skin on his body, it would have caused bruises of nearly 100 HP. Soren had just recovered a part of his HP with the help of vampiric touch, and his HP had decreased again, and his whole body had entered the state of serious injury. However, this attack also woke him up. He activated a legendary item almost without thinking, and at the same time his whole body rolled in an awkward posture to avoid the second attack. Summon Earth Elemental. Summon Shadow. A portal connecting to the elemental plane soon appeared, and then a heavy Earth Elemental appeared in front. Boom. The Earth Elemental hit the bear spirit with a fist, temporarily attracting its attention. At the same time, in a distorted shadow, a shadow that seemed to have a human shape appeared and directly launched an attack on the spirit bear spirit. Both of Soren's summoning spells were cast very quickly. One was the summoning ability of a legendary item, and the other was the supernatural ability of the Shadow Dancer. The attacks of the two summoned creatures obviously slowed down the pace of the spirit bear, and also bought precious time for Soren. He was finally free from the negative status effect caused by the sound wave attack. Even though he was heavily injured, Soren was still filled with fighting spirit. This was because the spirit bear in front of him had also been slashed more than 10 times. Coupled with the shadow erosion effect of Shadow Strike, it had also caused 100 to 200 points of damage to the enemy. In other words, the spirit bear's injuries would not be any better than Soren's. The intelligence of spirit creatures was not too high, and the fact that it used its ultimate skill meant that it had sensed danger. Soren didn't dare to fight it head-on, but it didn't mean that he had no other way. The curved sword in Soren's hand disappeared, and then a beautiful elven war bow appeared in his palm. He took out the quiver and put it behind him. Then he put an arrow on the bow and shot directly at the spirit bear's head. With Soren's dexterity, it would be impossible for the opponent to keep up with him if he tried his best to pull away, unless it could launch another roar attack. Stone to mud. Just when Soren shot the spirit bear, Vivian's petite figure also appeared in mid-air. She raised her little white hand and pointed in the direction of the spirit bear. Then the hard and solid ground turned into mud, and the huge body of the spirit bear sank directly. It took a long time for it to climb out of it. This level 5 spell had many uses, and how to use it depended on the person. Soren had asked the wizard to help him set up a huge trap with this spell. Swoosh swoosh swoosh. Soren shot 5 or 6 arrows in a row, and then pulled out his curved sword. There were no special arrows in his hand. Ordinary steel arrows could not cause much damage to the spirit bear. If he wanted to fly a kite, he had to be able to break through the spirit bear's defense. At the very least, he had to have 20 explosive arrows, frost arrows, poisoned arrows, and so on. Only then could it be possible to kite some powerful enemies. Ordinary arrows completely relied on the +2 armor penetration attribute of the elven war bow to cause 2 or 3 points of damage. It was quite difficult to kill the spirit bear, and it could only be used to reduce the opponent's HP. Missile Storm. Acid Arrow *2. Flame Arrow *3. After Vivian temporarily trapped the spirit bear with stone to mud, she began to cast continuously. It seemed that the little girl's combat experience was much richer than before. She actually judged in advance that as a divine creature, the spirit bear in front of her was difficult to control with ordinary spells. From its appearance, it could be judged that it had a very strong immunity ability. So the spell Vivian chose was not a control spell, but the stone to mud could have a control effect. Many wizard spells did not have to be controlled to be used to restrict the enemy's activities. A barrage of spells fell from the sky. Some of it was offset by the spirit bear's magic resistance, but the other part still seriously injured its body, especially the attack of the acid arrow and flame arrow, which caused quite a lot of damage to it. Soren's figure also rushed up at this time. The shadow bit and attacked around the spirit bear. It was a shadow creature and almost didn't have much weight. Although the earth elemental was about to fall apart, it still had 30% of its combat power. Die. Soren held his sword with both hands and slashed on the head of the spirit bear. It had already been in a state of near death by Vivian's spell bombardment, and finally ended under a round of siege. It was directly cut off by Soren. A bear's head fell to the ground. But there was no blood gushing out. The body of the spirit bear in front of Soren's eyes quickly dissipated, like fireworks, turning into a slightly shining light in the sky. This was the power of the elements. A fairly pure elemental energy, it was a body in a semi-energy state. The flying energy dissipated. Some of it condensed and became a crystal-like substance. This was a crystal stone after the elemental energy was highly condensed. It was a very rare tool. Other than legendary creatures that would leave it behind, only a part of it could be found in the elemental plane. This was an important material that many spellcasters needed. A row of data appeared. Launched beheading attack. Beheading successful. You've dealt 49/damage to the target. Target dead. You've gained 7500 slaughter EXP. Target is a divine creature. Automatically extracting divine energy from the target's body. You've gained 2 divinity points. A power full of divinity emerged and gradually integrated into Soren's body. He originally had 9 divinity points, and now he had accumulated 11 divinity points. He didn't know if it was because the spirit bear itself didn't have much wisdom, but Soren didn't feel a strong will in this divine energy. Instead, it was like some kind of chaotic and hazy subconsciousness. It was as if many people's prayers had gathered together and finally formed a consciousness with simple thoughts. This consciousness was quite weak. Because it didn't have much self-concept, it could be ignored compared to the will of the Dread Lord. Soren swallowed it without hesitation. Then, a divine light appeared in his eyes, followed by a series of data prompts. Fused divinity points. Divinity fusion successful. You fused 2 divinity points. Current total divinity points is 11. You've automatically mastered the minor divinity talent. Minor divinity, innate ability. You have a very weak divinity in your body. Although this divinity is nothing to many powerful existences, it has allowed you to gradually step into the realm of transcendence and sainthood. Due to your own ability, the transformation of the divinity you possess is biased towards the lower planes, so the effect of the minor divinity you possess is similar to other high-grade demons who are born with divine power. This divine power will gradually strengthen as your divinity points increase. All attributes +1. Chapter 270. All attributes +1. When Soren had the minor divinity, he looked completely different. Although his appearance was still the same as before, the aura he exuded was somewhat similar to that of a deity. If one had to describe it in Eastern terms, then there was a trace of unity of heaven and man, but this aura was obviously the unity of heaven and man of the devil path. Soren's originally delicate face now had a trace of evil charm. It was difficult to describe in words, but it was a real change. This kind of change in aura could easily attract mortals to him. The strength of the abyss demons largely came from the divine power they were born with. Basically, the high-grade demons in the abyss had a trace of divinity. The power of divinity could be gradually accumulated, so the struggle between high-grade demons was also very cruel. Many existences even robbed others of their divinity to strengthen their own strength. The almost endless demon army was the best target to rob divinity, but unfortunately, there were very few people who could succeed in the end. There must be an ancient history mentioned here. That was the Lord of Hell, Asmodeus. He was one of the oldest existences in the whole world. It was said that when he was first born, it was because of the appearance of the source of chaos. There were very few clear records about that history. It was only known that demons appeared in the source of chaos, which was the first demon army. This was the oldest demon army. Many of them were burning with raging flames. It was the ancestor army of the current 3rd generation of Tana-Re demons, a terrible creature born from the source of chaos. The demons crossed the universe uninvited and seriously threatened the oldest group of gods at that time, which was the ancient gods of order that had only a few records. This battle lasted for quite a long time. The ancient gods of order were tired of the endless war, so they began to create a creature to help them fight against the demon army. These creatures were angels. Of course, Soren preferred to call them Otherworld God's servant. Among these warriors with beautiful wings, Asmodeus was the most brave and the most beautiful one. He killed more demons than any other angel, and even more than any other god. But countless years had passed, and Asmodeus and other battle angels had gradually been infected with some of their enemies' characteristics. Gradually, their originally beautiful appearance became ugly, and the ancient gods of order and other angels began to fear them. They were devouring the divinity of the primitive demons. Even if this process was passive, they still changed day by day and became stronger day by day. Asmodeus' power became more and more amazing. Although he was still a servant of the ancient gods of order, he had begun to use the law to gain power for himself. The privileges and rewards he asked for from the ancient gods of order were gradually more powerful than many gods. The divinity of the demons was further eroding their bodies, and Asmodeus and his oldest subordinates were all transforming. Finally, demons were born. Asmodeus became the Lord of Hell, the ruler of the devils. He was the only one who could fight against a powerful god just by relying on his divinity and not his divine domain. There was also one of the few existences that could be great divinity. By the way, the devils had inherited part of the divinity of the primitive demons, so many of them were completely immune to fire damage, and many of the existing demons were not immune to fire damage. There were many legends about Asmodeus. But this was the one that Soren thought was most likely, because there were records in some ancient ruins that recorded the scene of Asmodeus fighting against the source of chaos. That was an era that was much older than the bloody war in the abyss. Almost none of the existing gods had lived from that era. Even many of the so-called ancient gods might not have been born in that era. Including the material plane that Soren was in, there were no gods in that era. It was even more impossible for gods to be born in this material plane. Soren had entered the realm of demons. Although he did not realize it himself, after obtaining minor divinity, he was indeed close to becoming a demon. The only difference was that there was a trace of a demon's aura on him. Demons were crazy existences, but demons were quite calm. If Soren's current strength was close to the demons, then his inner strength was close to the demons. As the main force of the bloody war in the abyss, demons and demons were almost irreconcilable enemies. But one thing that was undeniable was that whether it was the current third generation of Tana, demons or the demons that had survived until today, part of their power source came from the most ancient primitive demons, which was the evil power born in the source of chaos. Demons were still demons. Devils had only inherited the evil while maintaining the order of things. Knowledge, myth. The body of the spirit bear dissipated. An amber-colored gem-like crystal was left on the ground. Soren's eyes showed a trace of divinity. A row of data appeared in front of him. Acquired, minor divinity. The bloodline of the Son of Slaughter has acquired divine power. Awakened potential demonic abilities. Automatically mastered, minor fire resistance. Automatically mastered, minor poison resistance. Automatically mastered, minor electric resistance. Acquired supernatural ability, telepathy 10 feet. A large number of data displays appeared in front of Soren's eyes. Maybe it was because the divine power had broken through the critical point, dense zeros and ones began to appear in front of his eyes, and then gradually calmed down. Then he gained 3 more basic resistance specialties and a supernatural ability. Minor fire resistance, personal ability. Minor divinity gives you a part of resistance to fire damage. From now on, you are immune to any cold damage below 1 point. When attacked by spells or spell-like attacks, any damage with cold effects will be reduced by 1 point. With the strengthening of divine power, you will gradually increase your resistance to fire, and eventually may be completely immune to fire damage. Prerequisite: minor divinity. The 3 minor resistance abilities were the same. Unlike the cold resistance that Soren had acquired before, this resistance was not trained by him, but it was an effect of minor divinity, so it could only be strengthened by the improvement of divine power. Demons had naturally resistant skin. In the end, it was possible to be immune to any fire, poison, and electric damage, but most demons had lost their most ancient bloodline. Only the Baler, which was considered to have the purest bloodline, could be completely immune to fire, poison, and electric damage. So far, there were not many things that could be verified. The only thing that Soren knew was that almost all primitive demons were immune to fire damage, and the Baler was one of the more orthodox demon descendants that survived. The last one was a supernatural ability that was added by divine power. Telepathy 10 feet, supernatural ability. Divine power gives you a supernatural telepathy ability, and the range of this ability will gradually increase with divine power. Telepathy can be used in many situations. It can strengthen your abilities in all aspects, and at the same time, it can be stacked with special perception type abilities such as Sixth Sense, Evasion Intuition, Super Sixth Sense, and so on. This ability will gradually increase with the level of divinity. This was a very good supernatural ability. In a way, it made up for Soren's weakness of not having Evasion Intuition, but the range of its effect was still too small. According to the information in Soren's memory, the Baler was born with telepathy 100 feet. Speaking of which, he really couldn't understand how Cui Heighten killed the Baler with a challenge rating of 20 with just one slash. One had to know that his profession level was not as high as the Baler's challenge rating at that time. Under normal circumstances, even if he just stood there and let him kill it, it would take him a long time to kill it. Didn't you see how long Gandalf the Berserker Wizard fought to kill the Baler? After that, he directly leveled up to Gandalf the White-Robed Berserker Wizard. The power of divinity fused with the body. Soren's pupils were slightly red. This was not the influence of divinity, but the bloodthirst of the slaughterer form. Just killing the spirit bear was not enough to satisfy his bloodthirst after transforming into the slaughterer form. Soren had to kill more enemies to prevent himself from entering the slaughterer state. Vivian's petite figure landed on the ground. She seemed to be a little worried as she looked at Soren, who was in front of her with a strong murderous aura. At this time, Soren saw the true face of the shaman priest. It was actually an extremely thin natural dwarf. He was probably not young. No wonder he was so cunning and refused to come out. But in the end he still died in the hands of Vivian. Because the difference in strength between the two was too obvious, there were very few legendary professions in the indigenous tribe. Most of them were similar to the earthbound spirit that only appeared in the tribe. Let's go. Soren looked around and said in a deep voice, let's go and help them. Although the spirit and the shaman priest were killed, the battle was not over. There was still a lot of fighting power in the indigenous tribe. Soren had to suppress them as soon as possible and let these indigenous people surrender. Otherwise, when the battle was over, more than half of his pirates would be killed or injured. Just now, the proportion of his men who were injured had reached nearly 1/3. This group of idiots. Even the inferior aborigines had begun to resist, but they did not notice that they were about to be surrounded by thousands of ordinary people like dumplings in a moment. Discipline -3. Chapter 271. The sky was just beginning to brighten. The indigenous tribe was filled with cries and shouts. Many houses had been swept away and the ground was a mess. There were also many bloodstains and corpses that had not dried yet. The strong smell of blood attracted many dangerous beasts, but after seeing the village in front of them, they were smart enough not to approach. Piles of hides, belongings, and swords were collected and piled up in front of the chief's house in the center. There were also a lot of gold and silver weapons. The indigenous people liked to use gold and silver to show their status. The empty space in the center was filled with a dense mass of human heads. All the weapons were confiscated, and the captured indigenous people were all separated into women, children, and adult men. Then they were all tied together with ropes. There were not many old people among the indigenous people because their average life expectancy was less than 40 years old, so most of the indigenous people were adults. Children who were over 14 years old were also considered adults. They had not forgotten the battle last night. The bloodstains on the ground made these indigenous people full of fear. Especially the way they looked at Soren, it was as if they were looking at a very terrible existence. The battle ended soon after the soul essence was killed. There was basically no accident. Ordinary indigenous warriors could not block Soren's attack at all. Although he had just reached the realm of a high-grade profession, he was not without the slightest confidence in fighting against a legendary creature. The number of captives had not been counted, but there should be 800 or 900 people. After all, the people who escaped last night were only a few. The drows quickly controlled the situation. After all, the drows were also a race that relied on slaves. Sure enough. Soren looked at the busy men in front of him and said to himself, the drows' ability to do things is indeed much better than the pirates. Whether it was the discipline during battle or the process of capturing slaves. The drow warriors were completely superior to the elite pirates under Soren's command. The Drow society was supported by slaves, so they were also good at controlling slaves under the influence of what they saw and heard. However, the best at enslaving other races in the world were the soul suckers. That kind of creature was born to control other races. The Drows were still good at the dark arts, but for Soren, their abilities were indeed much better than the pirates. "Sir." A one-eyed pirate approached Soren and bowed respectfully. "I've finished counting." Soren looked at him and asked, "How are the casualties?" One-eyed dragon turned his head and looked behind him. He looked a little guilty and said in a low voice, 26 died, 42 were injured, and the rest were basically just minor injuries. I've already given those who couldn't be saved a quick death. The casualties were so high. Soren's face did not look good. He turned around and glanced at the Drows. Dark Blade was collecting the bodies of his companions. A total of 3 Drows were killed and most of the others were injured. The difference between the two was too great. This was the difference between disciplined and undisciplined in battle. Nearly 30 elite pirates had died. If it were other pirates, their morale might have collapsed. Looking back at the Drows, only 3 of them had died and only a dozen of them were injured. It seemed that in a large-scale battle, the strength of the pirates was indeed not that great. "Send a signal for people to come over." Soren looked at one-eyed dragon in front of him and ordered in a deep voice, "Use ships to transport these slaves back. First, transport the children and women back, then the adults. Let the people in the camp come over and help. If there are any strange movements, kill without mercy." The indigenous tribes did not have much wealth. All the spoils added up to 10 or 20,000 Kindler coins worth, and this was including the fur goods they had accumulated. These things had to be transported to the south coast to be exchanged for money. Here they were just ordinary daily necessities. Most of the captured indigenous people were ordinary people, but there were also a small number of professions. These people were strictly guarded and there were only about 50 or 60 of them. As for the original chiefs and high-ranking nobles, they had long been slaughtered by Soren. These high-ranking indigenous people must not be left alive. They must all be killed to control them. The pirates began to get busy. One by one, the ferocious pirates kicked and drove the indigenous slaves away. Many of their brothers had just died last night, so they were naturally not in a good mood now. Soren did not have much pity in his heart. He just warned them that they must not break the slaves because these were important assets that he needed. Long ropes tied the wrists of the indigenous slaves, and then pulled them forward one by one like animals. The warship had been docked in the river in front, and these slaves would soon be transported back to the camp. "Set fire." Soren looked at the ruined village in front of him and said in a deep voice, "Burn it all." A big fire ignited. Many of the Aborigines wailed and cried. Their former home had turned into a sea of fire. Now they didn't even have a place to stay. Seeing that the tribe was completely turned into ashes in the fire, many indigenous people were angry, but more of their expressions gradually became numb, as if they had lost hope and let the pirates take them to the warship. They were homeless and their tribe had been wiped out. They were now slaves and goods. Without a place to stay, they had no hope and no more choice. They did not even have the courage to resist. Thick smoke rose. Soren looked at the village that turned into a sea of fire in front of him, and then turned to look at the slaves tied up with ropes. He could not help but show a smile on his face. He finally had a foothold in the outer islands. After getting rid of the indigenous tribe in front of him, this island was his territory. Unless he took the initiative to provoke other indigenous tribes, the chances of them attacking Soren would be greatly reduced. At this time he finally had time to slowly develop, and these nearly 1,000 slaves also provided him with a lot of labor. The progress of the construction of the camp would be greatly accelerated. It's a pity for these cultivated lands. Soren stood on a higher slope and looked at the cultivated lands near the tribe. He could not help but feel pity. These cultivated lands are ripe after many years of cultivation, and there are specially dug ditches. Although the area is not very large, it is quite valuable. It's a pity that the place to develop is not here, and the river here is not very convenient to connect to the sea, so I can only give up all these cultivated lands. The cultivated lands could be developed again. However, the location of the natural port was difficult to change by manpower. Soren could not change his plan for a little land. His strength could not be dispersed because the outer islands were very dangerous. Chapter 272. It was about 10 o'clock in the morning. The first batch of indigenous slaves was transported back to the camp. The other pirates who did not participate in the battle all watched with curiosity and excitement, watching them drag groups of slaves from the ship. These indigenous slaves were relatively short, with dark skin and rickety bones. No one knew if they were born like this or if it was caused by living habits. The pirates kicked and kicked the indigenous slaves down, and then all of them were locked in cages in the camp. These slaves could not start working right away. Qualified slaves must be professionally domesticated. The slaves that were originally transported by Soren were still busy working. After seeing these captured slaves, they could not help but show curiosity and gloat, but there was not much pity and sympathy. Because there were not so many people in the world who were overflowing with sympathy, otherwise the paladin would not have become a spiritual symbol. Strictly speaking, this was an era of moral decay. Whether it was the noble class or the rich class, their lives were relatively luxurious and debauched. Even the poor of the lower class were not necessarily kind-hearted. Because of the hardships of life, many of them were full of resentment and extreme hatred. It was just that there was no chance for evil yet. Otherwise, no one would use the paladin as a tool. This situation would continue until the devils appeared. Their provocative words would arouse hatred in the hearts of these lower-class poor people, and eventually turn into widespread riots and rebellions. This was the precursor to the beginning of the Age of Turmoil. When rebellions and riots occurred, the arrival of the Avatar crisis was already very close. Vivian's figure appeared on the deck. The little girl seemed to be indifferent to everything in front of her. Although she was a very kind little girl and was very sympathetic to others as long as things involved Soren, then her moral concept would become, her brother is always right. So she just looked at it calmly, then turned and entered her room. In her mind, another guy was about to bare his fangs and brandish his claws, making the little girl want to pull him out and give him a good spanking, just like how Soren would occasionally spank her a few times when she made a mistake. Lillian. The little girl raised her slender eyebrows, raised her little white hand and knocked her forehead and said to herself, "What are you doing? Hurry up and calm down." He knocked himself on the head. At this moment the little girl looked a little silly but also cute. Looking at her, one could not help but want to laugh. "Do you feel it? Do you feel it?" Lillian's voice sounded very excited, as if she had discovered an earth-shattering secret. She waved her claws in Vivian's mind and said, "Didn't you feel it? You actually didn't feel it? You really are an idiot. Ah." Sure enough, Big Brother is the closest to me. Am I the only one who felt it? There was a hint of anger on Vivian's adorable little face, and she harumphed as if she were a little unhappy. "Lillian, are you crazy? If you have something to say it quickly. If you do this again, I'll lock you up. You should know that I'm in control of this body now." Lillian finally behaved herself. There was no other way. Although she was a little stronger between the two of them, Vivian was the one in control after all. Her control of the body was innately higher than hers, especially after Vivian also began to master divine power. Lillian seemed to be a little angry, but she did not dare to refute blatantly. She was like a naughty child who was completely suppressed by her parents. She held her breath and said, "You really are an idiot. You didn't even realize that Big Brother had merged with the divinity of the spirit bear. Big Brother also looks like a deity?" She finally noticed something. In the past, although Soren also killed the Son of Fear, he only absorbed the divinity, and the divine power was transferred to Vivian. Therefore the two little girls did not notice the difference in Soren. They just thought that the power of the killed Son of Fear had been transferred to them, but it was not completely transferred. However, everything that happened when dealing with the spirit bear made Lillian notice a slight difference. There was no transfer of divine power, and the divinity was directly merged with Soren. Son of Fear? Vivian was startled when she heard the words, then she frowned and murmured, "Is Big Brother also a Son of Fear? But why didn't he become like us? Big Brother doesn't seem to have divine power?" The room was silent. Vivian and Lillian seemed to have thought of something else, and they were all lost in thought. Soren could absorb divinity. But was he a Son of Fear? This time even Lillian was not so sure. On the other side, the tribe of the indigenous people had been turned into ashes. Soren led his men to watch over the indigenous captives, and at the same time he ordered the leader of the Drow warriors. Dark Blade Andri's expression was a little hesitant. It seemed that he was not willing to accept Soren's request, but he could not refuse it. In the end he could only helplessly say, "Your Excellency, we have sworn to give up our faith in the Spider Queen Lolth, so we have abandoned many cruel skills. I'm afraid your request will make us feel very embarrassed." "Is that so?" Soren had a playful expression on his face and he said slowly, "The Dark Maiden has fallen for so long. Is the faith of your tribe still maintained?" Without the divine skills bestowed by the gods, your decline is almost inevitable. Are you still pedantically pursuing the so-called kindness? You have been wandering in the surface world for so long, haven't you seen through the nature of this world? Kindness requires strength to maintain. Without strength, kindness will become weakness that can be bullied. You are already so weak, do you still want to abandon the important skills inherited from the drows? They may be evil and cruel, but at least they can maintain your tribe, right? Look at these indigenous people. If we don't find a way to strengthen ourselves, it will be difficult for us to survive here for a long time. Soren's words were like the devil's temptation, and Dark Blade showed a struggling expression on his face. The Sur in front of him was tempting them to fall again and find some evil traditions that had been abandoned. Those bloody, cruel, and ruthless methods were the key to the Drow's reputation in the Underdark. When they were pursuing kindness in the surface world, they had given up many cruel methods. These included extremely cruel punishments, as well as various methods of control and slavery. Soren raised his hand and pointed to the indigenous slaves in front of him, and said in an impassioned voice, "There are nearly 1,000 people here. They can work for us, provide us with food, build cities for us, and in the future, cultivate some of them for handicrafts. What we need, these people can bring us. Do you still expect the warriors in your tribe to work for us? I have been to the Underdark. I know very well how evil and cruel the traditions of the Drows are. I also hate the ruthless killing. But those are forcibly distorted wills to please the Spider Queen. We can abandon the traditions that appeared to please the Spider Queen and find the oldest dark skills of the Drows again, so that we can have a foothold here. Maybe you should ask the female priest in your tribe to come and talk to me. I think they will agree with my point of view." The Drows were really strong. If you knew anything about this race, you would find that every family of the Drows was in a cruel internal struggle, and from time to time children and brothers would kill each other. Then you would open your eyes and look, and you would find that every family of the Drows was fighting among themselves. The families in each city were still fighting among themselves, and the cities were still fighting among themselves. In such endless internal fighting and killing, the Drows could still dominate the entire Underdark and become the most powerful force. From time to time they could also send elite troops to counterattack and harass the surface elves. One could only imagine how powerful they were. Anyone who understood the traditions of the Drows could clearly feel that they were a race that courted death. The cruel rule of the Queen of Spiders was also quite courting death, but it was this constant courting of death that made both the Queen of Spiders and the Drows grow stronger step by step. When Soren walked in the Underdark with others, there was only one intuitive view in his mind. That was, if the Drow family and the Drow city united, they could form a huge army that was so powerful that it was terrifying in an instant. In the Underdark, the attack on the surface elves was carried out by a Drow city. In other words, the Drows were city by city and very few Drows were united. No one knew what the Queen of Spiders was thinking. Anyway, she had always encouraged the cruel struggle among the Drows. Perhaps she thought that this would make her feel happy. Punishment, slavery, assassination. The dark skills of the Drows were useful skills that Soren valued. They were crueler than pirates and more professional than slave traders. Especially the female priests among the Drows, they were experts in this category. Soren needed these evil means. Otherwise, it would take a long time for him to control these indigenous slaves. In the entire Underdark, the Drows' means of controlling slaves were second only to the Soul Eaters. They were more skillful than the Beholders, who were completely controlled by spells. Every Drow city had a large number of slaves, and their dark skills were accumulated over a long period of time. Of course, their evil also manifested in obscenity, chaos, depravity, taboos, and so on. What Dark Blade was worried about was that once the door of evil was opened, his people would return to their original lives, unless there was a strong external force to force them out of the abyss of complete depravity. Otherwise, the tradition of assassination within the Drows would gradually recover. It was difficult for people to become good, but it was a matter of a moment to become bad. Chapter 273. A day passed quickly. In order to transport these indigenous slaves back, Soren mobilized 3 large ships. Because they were worried that these indigenous captives would resist, they could only transport them in batches, escorting about 100 people at a time. After running back and forth several times, the final count of captives was 1,056 people. These captives were very useful. As long as they could be controlled, Soren's construction progress would be greatly accelerated, and it would save him the trouble of transporting captives from Port Tylon. Batches of people were transported back. By the time Soren was done, it was already dark. There were suddenly more than 1,000 people in the camp, and both space and food became tight. Fortunately, there were still a lot of rations in the indigenous tribe. Soren should have no problem supporting them for about 2 or 3 months. Because the number of indigenous captives was too large, Soren had to order his men to guard them strictly. All the captives were divided into 3 parts, and 50 or 60 people were left in each place to take turns to keep watch. Even the drow warriors were arranged to be in charge of guarding the captive indigenous warriors. These were very troublesome. It would be best if they could be subdued, but if they couldn't, Soren was ready to kill them all. At least he could get tens of thousands of slaughter EXP. Manpower was really important in a relatively barren era. Logically speaking, Soren's strict arrangement should not have any problems. Because he hardly slept that night, he just closed his eyes and took a nap for about 3 hours. There were only more than 300 pirates in the camp, and only 30 drow warriors, but the number of slaves and captives reached more than 1,300. In this case, it was difficult for Soren to rest in peace. He was even prepared to use cruel means to suppress the resistance of the captives. However, the real problem wasn't the captive natives, nor the slaves that were brought over. It was Soren's own men. His men were missing. There was more than one missing person. 3 people suddenly disappeared in the middle of the night. The pirate in charge of guarding the fence tower patted his chest and promised that no one went in or out at night, and no one approached the fence. But even so, 3 of Sauron's men were still missing. They disappeared completely inexplicably, leaving no trace behind. The pirate minion in charge of their shift stated that the 3 of them had completely disappeared from the campsite in the time it took to brew a cup of tea. How is this possible? Soren was sitting in the hall in the wee hours of the morning. He frowned as he listened to the one-eyed man's report. He murmured, "How could 3 living people just disappear all of a sudden?" These were all pirates who had experienced many battles. At the very least, they were Tier 2 pirates. His disappearance was so strange. This was probably not something that could be done through conventional means. "Keep looking." Soren looked at his subordinates in front of him and said in a deep voice, "Search the entire camp. I don't believe that 3 living people would disappear for no reason." The one-eyed pirate below nodded in response, and then the pirates set up their torches. Groups of pirates began to walk around the campsite. This sudden movement also caused some commotion among the captives, but no one acted rashly. The slaves of the inferior natives were still relatively high. One by one, the pirate minions scattered around the campsite. Some people even searched outside the fence, but there was still no trace of them. Half an hour quickly passed. Many people had returned to their original positions, but they couldn't find any trace of them. There were also no footprints leading outside. As for the footprints in the campsite, it was too messy to trace them. Time passed little by little. Soren naturally had to let his men rest when he couldn't find them. But he felt like something was pressing down on his heart, and he kept feeling that something was wrong. Soren naturally couldn't sleep in this situation. So he sat in the hall until a glimmer of light appeared on the horizon. But at this time, Soren suddenly heard a commotion outside and then some people's screams and screams. He, who had been sitting on the chair, opened his eyes almost instantly. Then he saw Soren's figure turned into a shadow and rushed to the place where the commotion occurred at an amazing speed. In front of him he saw a group of patrolling pirates. These pirates were hugging a person. In front of them, there were minions shouting and waving their swords, as if they were trying to stop something from getting close. The smell of blood. Soren frowned and leaped. His toes touched the wall of the house, and then his whole body flew through the air like an eagle, and then landed in front of the group of pirate minions. What Soren saw in front of him made his whole body tremble. Then a cold light appeared in his palm, and without hesitation, he slashed at the vague shadow in front of him. Shadow distortion. The space in front of Soren was like a distorted picture. Under the shadow of the house, there was a gray crack that looked like a crack. Inside it, there were 3 to 5 distorted shadows and 2 badly mutilated corpses. From the characteristics, scars, and clothes of these corpses, it was almost certain that they were Soren's pirates. The shadow crack. The space channel that connected to the shadow plane appeared for some reason. It had supernatural spatial power, and it was possible to directly suck people who were close to it into the shadow plane. Most of these shadow cracks appeared in places that were strongly connected to the material plane, and there were supernatural forces that maintained the operation of the cracks. Most of the time they would appear at a certain time, and then when the operation of the energy deviated, these shadow cracks would gradually disappear. Retreat! Soren yelled at his subordinates beside him. Then he leaped and passed through the shadow rift. Sword form, spinning strike. The scimitar in his hand drew a cold light and avoided the distorted shadows nearby. Then he kicked the corpses of the two pirate subordinates into the air and returned to the material plane from the shadow plane. Bang! The two corpses fell to the ground. The space of the shadow crack seemed to be gradually closing because the sky had begun to brighten. A string of data appeared in Soren's eyes, but he had no energy to look at it at this time. At this moment, the things that appeared in front of him had already shocked him greatly. He couldn't help but be stunned for a moment. Then he came back to his senses, stomped his foot, and rushed back to the material plane through the gradually closing crack of the shadow plane. At the moment when he returned to the material plane, Soren looked deeply in front of him. It was a tall tower that pierced the sky. A wizard tower that was almost intact, with gray stone walls, no more than 3 kilometers away. The location and direction were similar to the place where Soren found the mutated plant in his memory. The only difference was, the one in the material plane was a ruin, but the one in the shadow plane was a complete wizard tower. Chapter 274. Space Closure. When Soren's figure came out of the shadow fissure, the sun just happened to rise from the horizon. Then, there was some kind of unpredictable energy change, and the shadow fissure that appeared quickly disappeared under the shadow of the corner of the house. There was a blood stain on Soren's back, which was left behind by the twisted shadow. This kind of half-energy, half-material shadow creature was very difficult to deal with. Although it was only a third-grade monster, it could threaten the lives of high-grade professions. They had a natural ability to dodge attacks and half-energy attacks. The injury on Soren's back was nothing, and his powerful regeneration ability had already begun to heal. He calmly put away his curved sword, and then bent down to look at the two corpses on the ground. There were not many wounds on the corpses, and they did not die in the hands of the twisted shadow. Evil spirit? Or curse? Or something else? Soren's understanding of the shadow plane was second only to the Underdark, so after looking at the corpses, he knew that the pirates in front of him did not die in the hands of the twisted shadow. After they entered the shadow plane, they explored it for a while and then found the exit, but they encountered the twisted shadow. How is it? Soren looked at the others around him and said in a deep voice, "Can the other one be saved?" Of the 3 pirates that disappeared, 2 of them were dead, and the last one was covered in blood and had fainted. No one knew what happened to them when they fell to the ground. At this moment, the pirate who knew medicine had already rushed over. He stretched out his hand to check the breath of the unconscious pirate, and even opened the pirate's eyes to check other characteristics. With a serious face he said, "Your Excellency. He seems to have been cursed. I'm not sure. Whether he can survive or not depends on his luck." There were some pirates who knew a little about magic. After hearing his words, Soren's face did not look very good. He turned to look at the others and said in a deep voice, "Seal this place. No one is allowed to come near this area." The shadow plane was connected to his camp. It seemed that there was some incredible power in the shadow plane. This secret was most likely related to the ancient arcane empire. The tower Soren saw was even taller than Gloria's wizard tower. It was so tall that it looked like it was piercing through the clouds. This kind of construction was quite difficult, and it was built in the style of the arcane empire. This was because the legendary great arcanists were quite arrogant. They built such tall adept towers with the intention of standing shoulder to shoulder with the gods. Most of the ancient wizard towers in the material plane had been turned into ruins. Soren didn't expect that there would still be a wizard tower from the arcane empire in the shadow plane. This thing was very dangerous. Because if it was controlled by someone, then it would be a terrifying strategic weapon, basically not too far from an atomic bomb. But if it was not controlled by someone, then it was also quite dangerous. This meant that it had a terrifying defense program, so no one had controlled it until today. Soren was not naive enough to think that this wizard tower had been waiting for his arrival. There were also native creatures in the shadow plane. Although many of them were not very intelligent, it was easy for them to find this wizard tower, not to mention travelers from the material plane. For thousands of years. Someone must have found it, but he didn't know who had successfully entered it. In front of a resplendent and magnificent building, Adele Isabella stood in front of the door with a box in her hand. In front of her was a heavy steel golem. This was one of the territories of the Alchemist Guild. The great arcanists were still as arrogant as ever. It was quite difficult to meet them. Even the red-haired female pirate, who was a grade 4 profession, took 3 days to meet the person appointed by Soren. In the end, the other party was still busy with experiments and did not have time to meet an irrelevant woman. The glory of the wizards could still last for a while. At this stage, the great arcanists all over the world were still high and mighty. The Wizard Alliance's sphere of influence covered the whole continent, and they maintained contact with each other in a loose structure. Adele Isabella's face was not very good, because if someone wanted to see someone and waited for 3 days without seeing them, they would be in a very bad mood. She looked at the steel golem in front of her and said helplessly, "Well then. If Sir Lucian is really busy, then please help me pass this box to him. I believe he will be interested in the things inside. There is also a letter my master gave him." The steel golem looked at her, then nodded and put away the things. Don't underestimate these alchemy puppets. The great arcanists had already extended their magic to the range of souls. These alchemy life forms were all creatures with souls, but they were not complete souls, but some broken soul fragments. They had simple wisdom. Although most of them could not think directly, they were equivalent to smart computers. As for the more advanced alchemy puppets, they were complete life forms. They had souls, could think and could even learn to create, but they were quite emotional. The most common place for these life forms was the Clockwork Nirvana's mechanical mirror. The red-haired pirate sighed helplessly. She looked a little frustrated. Before she came, she was ready to complete the task given by Soren, but in the end she did not expect that she could not even see him. This was not a small blow to her, and it even made her doubt her own ability. There was also a sense of urgency in her heart. Now she only hoped that the great arcanist would take the time to look at the things she brought. Otherwise she would not know how to explain to Soren. In the past she did not have much contact with high-grade spellcasters. But now, Adele Isabella found that those high-grade spellcasters were really quite difficult to deal with. In the camp. Because 3 people suddenly disappeared last night, the other pirates could not help but have a trace of panic on their faces. Even if Soren ordered to block the news, the pirates still vaguely knew about the shadow plane. For ordinary people, supernatural things were very rare, and the things that crossed the material plane were more of a legend to them. The shadow plane was quite unfamiliar to the pirates. Many of them did not know what the shadow plane was, so many of them felt a little afraid because of the unknown. Knowledge of the plane. This was indeed a very distant thing because many people, except for wizards and other spellcasters, had to wait until they were close to the realm of half-legends before they could expand their vision to the scope of the plane. Soren's knowledge of the plane was not very rich. After all, he had only explored a few planes, but he was still very clear about the shadow plane. This was the core plane that was connected to the material world. Like the spirit world, it directly overlapped with the material world. It was like 2 folded pieces of paper about the same size, but one was at the top and the other was at the bottom. There was a slight difference between the two. The shadow plane belonged to the half-material plane, and there were many half-energy life forms in it, so it was more closely connected to the material plane. The spirit world belonged to the energy plane, and there were almost no flesh and blood life forms in it. Most of them were spiritualized beings, which were completely energy life forms, and were directly connected to the kingdom of death. Wizards had many spells that could let the soul enter the spirit world, or directly spiritualize the body to enter. These spells were a bit like the projection of the astral plane. The material plane, the half-material plane, and the spirit energy plane. These were the core 3 layers of paper. Outside these 3 layers of paper were the other planes of the multiverse, and everything was wrapped in the almost endless sea of the astral plane. Soren knew very little about traveling in the astral plane, but he knew that traveling in the astral plane without the strength of a legend was basically suicide. Most of the time, traveling in the astral plane was done through projection. It was rare for the real person to go there because the astral plane was too dangerous. Soren returned to the hall. The pirate leaders below were all gathered by him, and then they were assigned tasks one by one. Soren's face didn't change at all, as if what happened last night was nothing at all. As the core of the camp, he must be as steady as Mount Tai at all times, so that the people below could work with peace of mind. Time passed quickly. The order in the camp seemed to have been restored. Except for an area where no one else was allowed to approach, everything else was almost the same as before. The slaves were busy working and the pirates were speeding up the construction. Some of the native prisoners captured yesterday had already started working, and there were double the number of guards next to them to watch over them. These people couldn't be raised for nothing. When the drows began to move, soon all the native slaves had to start working. "Brother?" Vivian's petite figure appeared in the hall. She seemed to have just woken up. She raised her little white hand and rubbed the corner of her eyes and wondered, what happened? Why do you want to surround that area? Soren looked at the little girl who had just woken up, and a rare smile appeared on his face. He concisely said, this place is also connected to the shadow plane. 3 people went missing last night. I found a shadow crack there in the early morning, and I saw a complete wizard tower inside. Vivian, are you sure you can enter the wizard tower? The little girl's expression was serious. After a moment of contemplation, she said seriously, brother, a wizard tower is quite dangerous, especially a complete wizard tower. Even the 2 of us may not be able to crack its defense program. If it's really a complete wizard tower, I suggest you invite Sister Gloria. I'm afraid only she can crack many of the core keys. Chapter 275. Eastern Sea Route. 3 ocean cargo ships appeared in front of them, and the sailors on the deck could be vaguely seen. But because they were too far away, they were all small black dots. The half-elf first mate took off his delicate monocular with a grin, then made a gesture behind him. Immediately, a fast ship was released. Most pirate ships paid attention to speed, and the hull of the fast ship was relatively narrow. This kind of ship could not carry anything, but it was quite useful for intercepting cargo ships. Get close. The half-elf first mate's expression was a little excited, and he said in a deep voice, gunners, get ready. Catch up with the fast oars. Others, get ready to board the ship. Since he got the information about Eastern Sea Route, the half-elf first mate had been preparing to rob them. Not to mention the other goods on the ship, the craftsmen from the east were very important. These were all the manpower needed by His Excellency Throat Cutter. The half-elf first mate had been recruiting in Port Tylon, the city of wealth and Shipwreck Bay for a long time, but he still could not find first-class craftsmen. He heard that the woman, Adele Isabella, had gone to complete another task given by His Excellency Throat Cutter. As the half-elf first mate who had always wanted to be Soren's #1 fighter, he naturally hoped that his ability to complete the task could be better than the red-haired female pirate. In order to successfully take down the other party, he mobilized the elites of Port Tylon, Shipwreck Bay, and Snake Island at the same time this time. Soren took away some of the elite pirates, but there were still some left. Want to run? The ocean cargo ship in front obviously noticed that something was wrong, and it seemed to want to go around and escape. The half-elf first mate showed a playful smile and said in a deep voice, where can you run to on this sea? This south coast is the territory of His Excellency Throat Cutter. It's useless even if you run to the ends of the earth. Men, raise the black flag. Prepare for battle. A black flag was hung up, and the pirates shouted excitedly. The cargo ship in the distance was obviously a little flustered, but they began to arrange calmly. This made the half-elf first mate a little surprised. After all, their numbers were much higher than the other party. But it didn't matter. Recently, Soren's men had greatly expanded, and more pirates wanted to join. There were nearly 1,000 people near Shipwreck Bay. A small number of casualties were within the acceptable range. After all, the world was different, and most pirates were low-level professionals. Otherwise, according to the standards of Soren's previous life, a pirate king like him was equivalent to a pirate's nest owner who ruled over a region, with thousands or even tens of thousands of people under his command. One of the most representative figures was Jing Qinggong of the Ming dynasty. He monopolized a part of the ocean trade routes and used the wealth of ocean trade to support an army. Gloria? Soren could not help but fall into deep thought. As a former legendary rogue, he naturally knew how dangerous a wizard tower was, not to mention that it might be a wizard tower left behind by the Arcane Empire. Judging from the position of the wizard tower, Soren suspected that it was the work of an arcanist who built 2 wizard towers at the same time. One was built in the material plane while the other was built in the shadow plane. These 2 adept towers resonated with each other, and then acted as a passageway to open up the space between the planes, which then opened up a dimensional passageway to develop a dimensional demi-plane. Their final form. It was the legendary floating fortress at the core of the twin towers. The 2 wizard towers would rise at the same time and connect to each other. Soren had explored many ruins, and this kind of twin tower masterpiece was common in the ruins of the Arcane Empire. Because the great arcanists were very afraid of death and were very careful, they were afraid that someone would use the shadow plane as a springboard to find their weakness, so they simply built a wizard tower in the shadow plane. After all, they were quite rich. Soren's judgment was based on evidence. Because the location of the 2 wizard towers was similar, and there was a strange energy field in the material plane, It seemed that after the collapse of the wizard tower on the surface, there was still a part of the ruins underground. This was the sign of preparing to build a floating city. The wizard towers built in the current era would not develop a large underground space. Only the Arcane Empire liked to build a huge underground community under the wizard tower. If it was really a wizard tower from the Arcane Empire, then Soren had to be very careful. There was no other reason. In the era of the Arcane Empire, the standard combat guards of the Sorcerer Tower were not steel golems, but the legendary, magical construct puppet. In fact, Soren preferred to call them Magic Reaver. The technology of golems was passed down all the way from ancient times. This kind of technology had peaks and valleys such as the Nesser era, the Silver Age, the Arcane Empire, and so on. There were also many valleys such as the current golem technology. Soren had fought against some very difficult golems in the underwater ruins, so it could be said that he was quite afraid of this. It was simple to understand. It was like having someone take a sword and dismantle a Gundam. Just thinking about that scene was enough to make one drunk. Gloria? Soren looked at Vivian in front of him and gently nodded. If you can invite her over, it will be a lot easier. I just don't know if she is willing to come to such a remote place. Vivian heard the words and rolled her eyes at Soren. Her voice was a little cheerful. Sister Gloria will definitely be willing to come over. Because my brother is here and I am here too. Besides, if this is really a wizard tower left from the Arcane Empire, there must be a lot of very precious information in it, as well as the spells of the Arcane Empire. Sister Gloria must be very eager to get this knowledge. It would be best if she could come over. The Avatar crisis had begun to ferment, and it would not be long before the Queen of Spiders' plan began to be arranged. She was one of the first gods to come to the material plane, and soon the drows would gradually appear in the eyes of the world. Basically, in Soren's memory, there was no particularly safe place on the continent. The territory of the northern witches was also affected by the chaos, and the demons of the abyss and hell took advantage of it. If Gloria stayed in the north, she might not be as safe as in the outer islands. Soren actually cared about her very much. Maybe he could take this opportunity to invite her over. After all, he couldn't directly say that the world was going to change, that the world was going to collapse, and that the gods were all falling down to fight, causing the mountains and rivers to collapse, the sky to collapse, and the earth to sink. The demon army was killing everywhere, and the devils were sowing discord. In the end, the whole world was almost broken into pieces. If he said that, Gloria would probably think that he was crazy, or that he was so crazy that he couldn't be cured. Soren cared about very few people. Although his bottom line was getting lower and lower, and he was becoming more and more ruthless in his actions, he still hoped to be able to keep the people he cared about by his side so that he could protect them when necessary. Chapter 276. 3,000 miles south of the north. This was a lush high-slope area which used to be a lush forest. However, as the human kingdoms began to develop this area, a large number of trees were cut down, causing quite serious soil erosion. The consequences of this soil erosion directly led to the emergence of a yellow river, but it was not called the Yellow River in this world but the Nile-Dona River. This was the language of the Ascenda, the descendants of humans during the Arcane Empire, who could live to more than 120 years old. This name meant Turbid River. Looking south of the Nile-Dona River, there were scattered villages and towns. These were the gathering places of human beings. Since 300 years ago they had been constantly cutting down trees here. Now, from the Lost Forest to the Dark Forest area, the number of trees had decreased by at least 1/3. These trees were like the Han people in the Central Plains. For various reasons they cut down the forest in the upper reaches of the Yellow River, and then completely led to uncontrollable soil erosion. Regarding this matter, it could be said that the Druid Conclave was quite dissatisfied. There were fierce conflicts between the two sides because of this, but because there was no powerful Druid organization in this area, and there was another very special existence, so in the end the result was still inconclusive. However, after the soil erosion was more obvious, humans began to notice some problems, and a little restrained the cutting and development in the past. There was almost a budding industry here, but in the end, it was suppressed in the beginning by all forces. At this time, near the edge of the Lost Forest, a graceful and vigorous figure was moving forward at high speed. She was wearing an exquisite leather armor with a special emblem on her chest. Even though she was covered in dust, it could not cover up her heroic spirit. This was a knight in silver. She seemed to have been on the road for a long time. When she saw a thick smoke in front of her, she could not help but speed up her pace and rush toward the place where the smoke was coming from. A village appeared in front of them, but it was eerily silent. They couldn't hear the sounds of chickens and dogs barking. There were no signs of human activity. A loud and clear cry of an eagle rang out. Then an eagle flew down from the sky and turned into a middle-aged droll with thick hair for a moment. He glanced at the knight in silver next to him and said in a deep voice, "There is no one else nearby. I don't know why the Droll Council suddenly sent us here to investigate. Is there something more important here?" The knight in silver's expression was serious as she whispered, "Listen. There's no movement at all. There's almost no one alive here." The two of them headed towards the village. The village in front of him was almost destroyed. There were burn marks everywhere and there were many corpses on the ground. The knight in silver leaned over and looked at the corpses. Then, with a solemn expression, she said, "It wasn't done by bandits. None of their belongings were taken. It seems like the cause of their deaths is a little strange. Over there." The middle-aged droll closed his eyes and sensed for a moment. Then he pointed in a direction and rapidly approached. The knight in silver quickly followed. As they passed through the burned ruins of the house, everything in front of them made their faces pale. This was because they saw many corpses. There were men and women, young and old, as well as women and children. There were many traces of burning firewood nearby. In the center there was a corpse that was almost burnt to a crisp. There were many messy footprints on the ground. It seemed that many things had happened before everything happened. Fallen? The middle-aged droll looked around, turned around, looked at the knight in silver and asked, "Or other evil existences?" The knight in silver's expression was serious. She picked up a small piece of dark red skin from the ground and looked at it. Then she said, "It's the devil. Let's go. We must report to the council immediately. A devil has appeared here." Damn it. How did the devil of the purgatory of Bator come out? Eastern Sea Route. The half-elf first mate stuck out his tongue and licked the blood on his arm. He had just been stabbed by a sneak attack, but the injury was not serious. As a pirate he was used to being injured. Next to him his men were bandaging him. Some fierce pirates were kicking the surrendered captives, mainly some crew members who had no fighting power. "How are the casualties?" The half-elf first mate asked his men to tie a knot directly on the bandage. Then he stood up and said, "How many died? How many were injured? Have all the enemies been cleaned up?" A rather shrewd-looking pirate ran over, bowed his head and said, "Your Excellency. 32 died and about 50 or 60 were injured. All the enemies who resisted were killed. There were still people under the cabin who wanted to resist, but they were also killed by us. All the things are sealed under the cabin. We know the rules of His Excellency Throat Cutter. We can guarantee that no one will sneak down." "Okay." The half-elf first mate nodded slightly and said with satisfaction, "Don't touch the things below. When we return to Port Tylon there will be rewards for you." He stood up and walked down the cabin where the slaves were transported. Those things were nothing at all. There were other ways to make money. What he really cared about the most was the slave craftsmen from the east. The task given by His Excellency Soren was still the most important. The half-elf first mate quickly brought his men to the bottom of the cabin. Most of the slaves locked up inside had oriental characteristics. They looked a bit like people from the desert, but their skin was a little yellow. The outline of their faces was not as clear as the people here, and the lines of their faces were softer. "Who are the craftsmen?" The half-elf first mate looked at the 50 or 60 slaves in front of him. The eastern trade route would not transport those cheap goods, so the quality of the slaves in front of him was relatively high. A quick-witted guy quickly came over and answered, "There are more than 30 craftsmen here. There are more than 10 over there. All of them are imported Eastern gladiators. They will be sent to the City of Wealth and then sold to the underground arena on the south coast. These slaves are all very valuable." "Gladiators?" The half-elf first mate showed a look of interest on his face. He walked in front of an Eastern gladiator and looked at the strong man in front of him. The man's muscles were not very strong, not as exaggerated as many of the warriors here, but his muscle lines had a sense of strength and fluidity. It was said that the Eastern gladiators were more agile, and some of them had been trained by Eastern monks. It seemed that the rumors were true. Note: many of the Eastern warriors are level 1 or 2 martial monks. Their training method is similar to that of martial monks. "Take them all back." The half-elf first mate glanced at the shackles on the other party's hands and said, "These people look a little useful. His Excellency Throat Cutter is in need of manpower. Maybe there will be a chance to use them." He glanced at the innermost part of the cabin, then walked over carefully and asked, "What's in the cage over there? Why is there no sound at all? Is it empty? Someone immediately brought a torch over. As the light shone, the creature in the cage appeared in front of them. Many people couldn't help but exclaim in surprise. Then, someone suddenly realized something and said, Is this an Eastern werbeast? What appeared in front of them was a little girl. She was a very, very small girl, at most 6 or 7 years old. She was wearing a floral dress and her face was a little messy. However, one could see her big eyes and fair skin. That wasn't the most amazing thing about her. What was even more amazing was her ears. They were furry like a cat's ears, and there was a small cat's tail sticking out of her butt. A werbeast? The half-elf first mate couldn't help but look at her in surprise, then murmured, "It seems to be the legendary Catwoman? I thought this kind of werbeast was extinct. I didn't expect to find one in the East." Whoosh. Facing a group of ferocious-looking pirates, the little girl in front of them seemed a little afraid. However, the courage in her heart made her bare her teeth at them, revealing an obvious pair of small canine teeth as if she was wild and untamed. Werbeasts began to decline significantly after the Arcane Empire and were now very rare. The specific reason for their appearance was unknown. Anyway, legend said that it was related to something taboo. After all, the great arcanists had always wanted to get their hands on the realm of the gods, including the part of creating life. The half-elf first mate looked at her curiously, then ordered, "Don't hurt her. This Catwoman looks quite rare. Bring her back and give her to the young mistress as a gift." The young mistress he mentioned. Of course he was referring to Vivian. But in fact he was mainly referring to Vivian because only she would occasionally order them around. Now, among Soren's core subordinates, who didn't know that Vivian was the apple of Soren's eye? Not to mention Vivian's strength was somewhat unfathomable to them. The half-elf first mate walked out quickly. There were already a few people waiting outside. One of them, a middle-aged man with a pair of single-rimmed glasses, looked a little gentlemanly and didn't look like a pirate. Instead, he looked more like a merchant's shopkeeper. The goods on the 3 ships have been counted. There are a total of 26 boxes of porcelain, 21 boxes of tea bricks, about 12 boxes of other spices, and some rare silk fabrics. The total value is probably more than 50,000 Kindler coins. If we can sell them to the local nobles, the value is estimated to increase by 50%. Hearing these words, the half-elf first mate couldn't help but stare blankly. Then he murmured, "So much. So valuable?" He felt that something was a little wrong. Because the value of the goods on the 3 ships seemed to be quite high. And they were the most expensive and valuable goods on the Eastern Sea route. Chapter 277. In the hall. Soren fell into deep thought. After a while he seemed to have made a decision. He raised his hand and called in a few words, then walked towards the place where the slaves were held. The Drow's enslavement skills were quite brilliant. Not only did they use a variety of punishments, but they also used powerful psychological cues. Many ordinary creatures would gradually become more obedient once they accepted the change of their status as slaves. After further training, they would become qualified and docile slaves. The slave's consciousness of resistance was actually not too strong because most creatures had a servile nature. It was better to be alive than dead. The inferior natives that were captured last time were basically working. Their status in the tribe was similar to that of slaves because the basic structure of the native tribe was chiefs, priests, nobles, warriors, inferior people, and slaves. However, these natives would slack off from time to time, and they didn't work that hard. They needed to be whipped by the pirates in charge of supervising them to be obedient. Soren walked around a little, then went to the place where the shadow crack appeared. At this time he also took out the information prompt that he had read once. "You've entered the shadow plane. You've completed your first official interplanar travel. You've obtained part of the information of interplanar travel. Your dexterity has reached 25 points. You've successfully entered the shadow plane. You've obtained part of the information of the legendary skill, Shadow Realm." This was the information prompt that he got when he entered the shadow plane. Soren was not too unfamiliar with the legendary skill, Shadow Realm, so it was not surprising that he got the information prompt of this legendary skill because this legendary skill was composed of 3 parts. In other words, this information prompt needed to appear a total of 3 times, and it had a very high requirement. After successfully meeting the requirement, Soren could master the legendary skill, Shadow Realm. Back then he had received the first message even earlier than now because someone had opened the shadow portal for him at that time. For now, it would take some time to get the 3rd information prompt. Soren had to at least raise the total profession level of the rogue to above 15 before he could get the second information prompt of Shadow Realm. As for the third information prompt, the requirement was even higher. Soren's life form must have a certain connection with the shadow plane. Any kind of domain ability was quite difficult. Naturally, it was quite difficult to master. There was another notification. That was the first notification that appeared. It was a passive supernatural ability. Stats were one of the most important foundational abilities in a player's body. Normally, once a player reached 20 points, they would enter the realm of transcendence. Among all the stats, Constitution was the easiest to break through. When a player reached 20 points, they would be able to obtain their first passive ability, which was the regeneration effect that Soren had chosen at the beginning. As for the later special abilities, they would need to have at least 25 attribute points. Coincidentally, Soren's dexterity had increased to 25 points after obtaining Minor Divinity. Thus, he mastered a passive ability. Epic Dexterity, Gifted Ability. Your dexterity has exceeded the limits of mortals. Be it your sense of balance or coordination, they are all at a level that mortals can't reach no matter how hard they try. I'm afraid that only characters from Legends and Legends, as well as the incarnations of gods that descended to the mortal world, would be able to compete with you in terms of agility. From now on, your agility has completely surpassed the realm of mortals. You will gain an epic +1 point in all agility-related tests. At the same time, your basic evasion will be permanently +2. Note, legendary evasion is a prerequisite skill. This was an important passive ability for rogues. Not only because of the epic +1 point, but also because of the permanent +2 evasion bonus. Basically, many powerful legendary abilities in the future required the corresponding epic attribute as a prerequisite. For example, epic Constitution was the basic condition for many powerful abilities of warriors. As a qualified legendary profession, at least one attribute must be increased to more than 25 points. Half a day passed quickly. At night, Soren and Vivian both came to the place where the shadow cracks first appeared. Although he intended to invite Gloria over, Soren was still going to go in and check it out first. After all, as long as he didn't get close to the wizard tower, it was relatively easy for him to deal with the creatures in the shadow plane with his current ability. Not to mention that the creatures in the shadow plane were cross-plane enemies. Although it was quite difficult to deal with them, there was an innate reward of about 20% slaughter EXP. But for cross-plane enemies, compared to the monsters in the material plane of the same level, there was basically a 10% to 20% slaughter EXP reward. That was why many people liked to run into the abyss of hell. Time passed little by little. Soren waited until early morning, but he didn't see the shadow cracks appear. At this time Vivian, who was sitting next to Soren, was a little sleepy, and her little head was leaning on Soren's leg. It seems that it may not appear today. Soren reached out and stroked the little girl's hair and said softly, "Vivian, why don't you go back and rest first and I'll wake you up when it appears." The shadow cracks didn't appear regularly. There were many factors that could affect its appearance and even its location could change. So when it did not appear until now, Soren knew that today might not be the day for it to appear. Anything that could cross planes required a little patience. Back then, in order to wait for the entrance to the underground ruins to appear, he had waited in the desert for an entire month and a half before the dimensional passage to the ancient ruins appeared. The final reward was naturally quite rich. Vivian gently shook her head, and then shrank into Soren's arms. Since she didn't want to go back and rest, Soren couldn't force her to go back. He took off the cloak from his back and covered the little girl's body, and then silently watched the shadow in front of him. The night passed just like that. Soren waited until the sun rose, but the shadow cracks still didn't appear. He wasn't too worried about it. During the day he was still busy giving orders to his subordinates to supervise the slaves' work, and the whole camp was built little by little. Then when night fell, he went to the location where the shadow cracks appeared, and waited quite quietly for the night. Time passed like that for 2 days. On the third day, when Soren came to keep watch, a crack gradually appeared in front of his eyes, and he could see another gray world through it. Chapter 278. It appeared. Soren waited for 3 whole days and finally the shadow fissure appeared. He turned around and glanced at Vivian behind him. Today she was wearing a black princess dress with a beautiful bow on her head. After noticing Soren's gaze, the little girl smiled sweetly and said, "Big brother, I'm so happy to see you. Don't worry. I've read a lot of information about the shadow plane. I'm sure there won't be any danger. Besides, Sister Gloria used to tell me a lot about planes and half-planes. Maybe she knows more than you. The shadow plane. Soren was most familiar with this plane, even more so than the prime material plane. It was a transitional plane connecting the material plane with other planes. Strictly speaking, it was a large semi-material plane, a spatial world between matter and energy. From the shadow plane, one could reach most planes, so there were a lot of unpredictable dangers in this plane. Especially at the edge of the overlapping planes, one could be directly sucked into space turbulence. That was why Soren was very careful every time he entered the shadow plane. There were a lot of dangerous areas and powerful creatures here. The most common one was the shadow dragon. There weren't many types of dragons in the shadow plane, but the shadow dragon was the most numerous. Strictly speaking though, Soren did remember where the nests of many shadow dragons were, but he couldn't beat them at all. Even if he had Vivian with him, it would still be a little difficult because he remembered that the shadow dragons were all mature and above. The world began to turn gray. As Soren's figure passed through the shadow fissure, his whole body was dyed with a gray hue. The shadow plane didn't reject other colors, but any color here would have a gray shadow. This change came from the structure of the plane. No one could resist it unless they used a spell. It was one of the rules of the plane. For example, the sky and sun of the shadow plane. Sometimes it would rain, snow, and hail, but the color would always be gray. No matter how bright the sun was, it could only ever be a bright gray color. That was why it looked like dusk. This was the paradise of shadow creatures. Be careful. Soren turned around and looked at Vivian, who was looking around. The little girl seemed to be very interested in this plane that was completely different from her original world. She even curiously reached out to pull out the weeds on the ground. The color of the plants was grayish-green, and there was no difference between them and the material plane. There were many unknown secrets about the existence and characteristics of the shadow plane, and some were even unknown to the gods. Therefore, there were still many inexplicable things about this place. For example, the buildings here might be extremely similar to those in the material plane. And it might not necessarily be the current material plane. It was possible that the shadow plane retained the buildings of the material plane thousands of years ago. Projection. The incomprehensible projection interfered with matter and was then replicated in the shadow plane. This kind of projection could not be understood with common sense, and not everything could be projected. So far, no one had been able to figure out this secret. Most of the things that could be projected into the shadow plane seemed to be random, but there was an energy limit to this projection. For example, a castle from hundreds of years ago in a material plane could be projected into the shadow plane, but a wizard tower built in a material plane could not be projected into the shadow plane. This was because most of the castles were ordinary buildings, but wizard towers were covered with a considerable amount of energy. Soren had traveled back and forth in the shadow plane so many times, and the only thing he knew was that most of the buildings projected from the shadow plane were things that had existed in the material plane for a long time. If it was just a house built this year, it was basically impossible to project into the shadow plane. However, if the house had existed in the world for hundreds of years, it could be projected into the shadow plane. Therefore, there were many cities and towns in the shadow plane. The places where these projections appeared could be quite ancient, and there were some shadow creatures living there. The projected buildings were not much different from those in the material plane. They would gradually disappear with time, so there were very few things that had existed in the shadow plane for a long time. A wizard tower appeared in front of him. Looking at it from afar, he could feel the majesty of it. It was different from the current wizard towers. During the Arcane Empire, wizard towers pursued height. The great arcanists often liked to build wizard towers to overlook the earth. The overall structure of a wizard tower was a bit like a lightning rod. Today's wizard towers were generally relatively short, and they rarely exceeded 300 meters in height. Therefore, it was easier to identify wizard towers from any period. Be careful. Soren raised his hand to stop Vivian, who wanted to go over and take a look. He whispered, "There are distorted shadows nearby." Distorted shadows. Semi-energy life forms, due to certain reasons, may have the characteristics of a soul. To put it simply, many of them were transformed from souls. Distorted shadows, shadow life, gregarious species, grade 3. Challenge rating 12, personal level 14, has spell-like abilities. Highest and lowest attributes 20, lowest attributes 10, total attribute points 90 to 95. Special abilities, shadow characteristics, semi-energy body, soul molding. Difficulty, B+. Soren was quite familiar with the ability of the distorted shadows, but he still found it difficult to deal with them because these creatures were not vulnerable to physical attacks. Semi-energy life forms were born with more than 20% concealment ability. If they were half-energy life forms, they could also reduce physical damage by 50%. It was very troublesome to deal with them with ordinary weapons. Although Soren had the legendary curved sword Icing Death, he basically did not have the ability to kill a distorted shadow in one hit. Moreover, these shadow creatures like to live in groups. Therefore, their difficulty was B+, and they were a very difficult enemy to deal with. Sizzle. There was a faint sound coming from somewhere. Soren quickly took a step forward and protected Vivian's small body behind him. At the same time, he carefully looked around. There were not many life forms in the shadow plane. Strictly speaking, there were not many living creatures with flesh and blood. Therefore, the animals living here were quite rare. Sometimes, it was so barren that even the shadow dragons had to go to the material plane to eat a big meal. The life forms here were full of destructive and aggressive. They were a combination of chaos, hatred, and bloodlust. In essence, they were not much better than the bottomless abyss. Distorted souls could be reborn in the shadow plane. This was the origin of many half-energy life forms. There were also a lot of undead here. Creak. The sound became louder and Soren also heard the source. It came from under the soil in front of him. Under the soil? Soren's rich experience in the past made him ready to fight in an instant. At the same time, he said to Vivian beside him, "Be careful. There are undead ahead. They smell the living on us." Undead. Supernatural monsters. There was only one kind of undead in the shadow plane, and it seemed to be a difficult monster to deal with. Skeleton undead. When Soren saw a monster crawling out of a tomb-like mound in front of him, his face gradually became serious. Because the skeleton undead in front of him was a little different. Its height was more than 2 meters. Although its bones had been twisted and mutated into sharp bone blades, it could still be seen that it was a tall and dangerous creature when it was alive. The next level of this undead was the skeleton demon, a quasi-legendary undead with a challenge rating of 12 and a monster level of 20. There was no priest. There was no way to dispel the undead. Soren glanced at Vivian beside him, nodded gently, and flew away. It seemed that he really needed to find a priest partner in the future. After all, whether it was healing or dispelling the undead, a priest's role was quite important. They were the core members of the Iron Triangle. But the problem was, where could Soren find a priest above grade 3? This kind of priest status was not low. Just look at the pivotal position of the Naga Siren priestess in the coastal area, and you would know how high the status of a high-grade priest was. Da, da, da. Soren's curved sword in his hand made a burst of metallic sound on the body of the skeleton undead. At this level, the undead were not simple skeletons. They were very dangerous supernatural creatures. Ghoul touch. When Soren slashed several times on the body of the skeleton undead, suddenly there was a foul smell around. A dark red glimmer appeared in the eye sockets of the skeleton undead in front of him. This smell made Soren very alert and took a step back, but the undead still touched him slightly. Spell-like attack. It was the innate ability of the high-grade undead. Soren almost had no time to react, and a series of data appeared in front of his eyes, affected by the spell, Ghoul Touch. Mandatory test of exemption triggered. Test of fortitude passed. You are immune to the paralysis effect of this spell. A control-type spell. Soren suddenly broke out in a cold sweat, and then he slashed the enemy's leg bone with his sword. Fortunately, he had high constitution and fortitude, so he was directly immune to this second circle spell. Otherwise, he would have been paralyzed directly, which would be quite dangerous. Fortitude, will, spell, and so on. All kinds of immunity were quite important. Rogues were not as muscular as warriors, so they were at a disadvantage in terms of test of exemption. Be careful. Vivian's reaction was also very fast. When Soren was hit by the skeleton undead, she began to cast spells quickly. However, the little girl's talent was really amazing. While casting spells, she could also pay attention to the surrounding environment. When she saw distorted shadows around her, she immediately shouted, "Brother, be careful. There are a lot of distorted shadows around you." Chapter 279. Twisted Shadows. These half-energy shadow creatures did not need to eat like other monsters, and they did not have a fixed nest. They did not even leave traces of movement. Therefore, most of the time, there was no way to determine their location at all. Only when these monsters emerged could one know which shadow they were hiding in. Fortunately, these monsters basically had no intelligence. They acted purely on instinct and were full of destructive desire and aggression. Otherwise, they would be quite difficult to deal with. Clusters of shadows emerged. These twisted shadows had a characteristic, that was, in the strange twisted bodies, there was a vague and hazy human figure hidden in the shadows. It was said that this was their soul. Twisted shadows were said to be the souls of many creatures that died in the shadow plane. These shadow-like monsters were everywhere in the shadow plane, especially in the cities of the shadow plane. These shadow-like creatures were often seen. Flame arrow. Acid arrow. Missile storm. Because Soren was in the range, Vivian did not dare to use a large-scale attack spell. She could only kill the twisted shadows one by one. At the same time, she used acid arrow to aim at the skeletal undead. Acid was very corrosive to bones. Although acid arrow was only a spell below grade 3, it was very lethal to many creatures. Stone skin shield. Haste. Soren did not dare to be careless in this situation. He directly activated the elemental stone, and at the same time activated a piece of equipment that he obtained from the legendary naval battle. It could temporarily activate the haste effect, but it could only be used twice, and the duration was relatively short. High-grade rare items were too rare. There were not many of them on the south coast. The best equipment Soren had was the 2 items given to him by Princess Royal of Arendelle. It seemed that after dealing with the outer islands, he would have to take time to go to the desert area. Soren remembered that there were 3 legendary items there, as well as the Cloak of Anti-Detection, which was very important to rogues. Da, da, da. His curved sword turned into a ray of light and slashed at the skeletal undead. Soren jumped more than 10 meters and slashed at the twisted shadow at the same time. The blade seemed to have cut into tough rubber. Soren furrowed his brows as he slashed at the shadow. At the same time he retreated. However, the shadow had already pounced on him. Even though the shadow's arm only brushed past Soren's shoulder, he couldn't help but tremble. A row of data popped up. You've been attacked by distorted shadows. Distorted shadows has dealt 1 bruise to you. You've been affected by shadow erosion. Received an additional 14 damage from shadow corrosion. Shadow strike. Soren countered the attack with a backhand slash. Twisted Shadow's corrosive attack was similar to Shadow Strike. Both attacks used shadow energy to corrode the opponent. The distorted shadows didn't have high HP. After being hit by Soren a few times, one of them finally died. Soren received a total of 3,250 slaughter EXP. Shadow-type monsters gave 20% slaughter EXP. Hailstorm. As soon as Soren put some distance between them, Vivian took the opportunity to cast a spell. The little girl quickly chanted the spell, and then a whistling wind and sharp hail appeared within a 40-foot radius. This was a level 4 spell. It wasn't a very common spell, but it was perfect for the current situation. It just so happened that Soren was out of the spell's range. Compared to the explosive impact of Fireball, Hailstorm was able to slightly affect the enemy's movement while killing them. Sword form, spinning strike. Sword form, beheading. Soren took the opportunity to kill 2 distorted shadows around him. After enduring the shadow energy's corrosive attack, he finally got rid of the trouble around him. The next part of the battle became a lot easier. Vivian's hailstorm caused a lot of cold damage. Soren turned around and began to harvest the distorted shadows' heads. He received nearly 20,000 slaughter EXP in one breath. However, the skeletal undead died in the hands of Vivian in the end. Its cervical vertebra was directly melted by the acid arrow. Otherwise, it would have given about 5,000 slaughter EXP. He simply cleaned up the battlefield. The skeletal undead didn't give anything. Instead, the distorted shadows dropped 3 gray crystal fragments. These were materials for alchemy. A kind of crystal that contained soul energy and elemental energy. Only a few special creatures would appear. This crystal could be directly used to exchange equipment in the hands of high-grade wizards. Soren carefully put it away. He had been too busy recently to learn alchemy. Vivian focused on learning spells and basically didn't dabble in alchemy. The brother and sister probably had less than 50 alchemy points combined. The two rested for a while and then moved forward again. However, this time they had to be more careful. Vivian didn't dare to run around because it was obviously more dangerous than the material plane. There were almost no monsters after that. Soren led Vivian forward for about 300 meters. A broken building appeared in front of them. They were already close to the periphery of the wizard tower. There were many broken buildings nearby. It seemed that there used to be a group of people living around the wizard tower. Be careful. Soren turned around and looked at the little girl. He then said, "Let's see what's here. It seems that no one has been here for a long time. Don't get close to the wizard tower so that you don't trigger its defense mechanism." Vivian nodded gently and then said with a serious expression on her little face, "Big brother, there seems to be a legendary defense lock in front of us. This might be the wizard tower of an arcanist." It was gray in front of them. The space under the wizard tower seemed to be a little distorted, and it didn't look real. Maze lock was a technology from the Arcane Empire, and it could be understood as a very powerful array. Those who could set up a maze lock were basically arcanists. During the period of the Arcane Empire, not all wizards were arcanists. This was an advanced profession that required a lot of talent. It could be understood that only legendary wizards could advance into the Great Wizard. The two were advanced professions with a certain origin. Soren nodded slightly and then pushed open a door on the left. It was full of dust. There didn't seem to be any monsters, but there didn't seem to be anything either. When Soren was about to leave, he suddenly seemed to have found something. He immediately squatted down and knocked on the wall with his hand. Then he pulled out his curved sword and stabbed it in, directly digging a hole in the wall. It was empty. There was a delicate box in the hole about 30 centimeters wide. "Fortunately, my searching ability is not bad." Soren reached out and knocked on the box. He then signaled Vivian to step back. He took out a lock-picking tool from his multidimensional bag and was about to open the box. Chapter 280. There would be many secret compartments in the ruins. This was related to the habits of the people in the current world. Whether it was nobles or wizards, many liked to set up some secret compartments in their homes to store things. This habit was similar to the ancient landlords in the Central Plains who liked to dig cellars to store gold and silver. Some even put the cellars in places that others could not imagine. Therefore, in the adventure of the underground ruins, it was necessary to have a teammate with good search skills and intuition about the location of the treasure. This kind of person was usually a rogue. A teammate with the intuition of a treasure-hunting mouse was also very popular in the adventure of the wilderness ruins. Soren's intuition was not very strong. Strictly speaking, he basically did not have the talent of intuition. It was entirely based on careful observation and rich experience in the past that he found that there was something wrong with the wall just now. There were different traces in the seam and the color was slightly lighter. Then he reached out and knocked on the wall. The hollow wall could be felt with a knock. Then he directly used his curved sword to cut the wall open. For this kind of ancient ruins, it was not realistic to find the location of the opening mechanism because it might have been completely damaged. When Soren had just started his career, he was blocked by a stone statue for a long time. He could not find a way to open it. In the end, the barbarian among his companions came with an axe. They found that the mechanism of the hidden compartment had been damaged. If they did not open it by force, they would not be able to find the mechanism outside for a lifetime. Then Soren began to study the aesthetics of violence. He mastered the violent demolition technique in the exploration of the underground ruins. The key to this demolition technique was to destroy the mechanism without damaging the things inside. It was also a very useful skill, and it had a significant effect on many underground ruins. Dang dang dang. Soren touched the box and knocked it a little. After making sure that it was not a trap device, he began to prepare to pick the lock. However, he had just inserted the lockpick tool into it and then he pulled it out. He picked up the handle of the legendary curved sword, Icing Death, and smashed it directly at the position where the box was locked. After 3 consecutive bangs, the lock of the box was finally broken. Soren turned around and glanced at Vivian. The little girl's mouth was slightly agape. She had seen her brother pick locks with exquisite skills, but she had never seen him smash them open so violently. After all, Soren used to be a skilled thief and he wasn't as strong as he was now. Soren turned around and glanced at Vivian. Slowly he said, "The lock inside is already rusted. There's no way to open it. Be careful, step back. I wonder if there are any traps inside." Vivian nodded and took a small step back. There was a saying in adventure, break locks, break doors, break boxes and guarantee that you won't die. Soren put the box on the ground and opened it carefully. There was no sound of a mechanism being activated, nor was there any magic being triggered. It looked just like an ordinary box. This kind of trap was impossible to guard against. He was used to being careful. After all, there were many rogues who failed miserably. There weren't many things in the box. Soren saw 2 gems, one was a diamond, the other was a carnelian, and then there was a magic scroll and an empty crystal bottle. It. Soren threw the diamond and carnelian to Vivian behind him. The little girl reached out and caught them. Her beautiful big eyes narrowed into a crescent moon. She wiped the dust on the gems with her sleeve and put them away. Vivian liked gems. Whether it was diamonds, emeralds, or carnelian, she liked these things very much. The little girl had now filled a small box. Part of it was given to her by Soren, and the other part was from her robbery of the pirate leader below. But it was mainly because Lillian would do it. In this regard, Lillian refuted, "I'm the Witch of Fear. If I don't have a lot of gems, won't I lose face? So what's yours is mine, and what's mine is still mine." Yes, that's it. The bottle was empty. It might have been filled with some kind of potion in the past, but this kind of crystal bottle used oak stoppers. The potion inside might have evaporated long ago. Even if the potion inside was still there, Soren didn't dare to taste it. This potion was at least 100 years old. Back then, there were people who died in a daze. They dared to taste the potion that sank in the ruins 1,000 years ago. As a result, they died instantly from the poison. One of Soren's rules was to not eat anything in the underground ruins, including water. The spell scroll was still intact, which surprised Soren a little. This was because the material of the spell scroll must be very good to be able to be preserved for such a long time. He carefully opened the spell scroll, afraid that it would be damaged by too much force. But it seemed that Soren worried too much. This scroll was made of an unknown leather and it felt quite tough to the touch. This might be a high-level spell scroll. Thinking of this, Soren's face couldn't help but reveal a trace of surprise and expectation. The value of a high-level spell scroll was quite astonishing. If he could get his hands on one, then this trip would be worth it. However, when he saw the mark engraved on the spell scroll, Soren couldn't help but reveal a trace of disappointment. There were engravings on the spell scroll, which represented the circle of the spell recorded. This was a third circle spell scroll. Because there were 3 intersecting engravings on the top corner, no one would deliberately make a mistake. So this spell scroll should only be a third circle spell. A third circle spell. It didn't seem to have much value. Soren had already bought a batch of spell scrolls from the City of Wealth. Among them, the proportion of third circle spells was not small. Maybe the scroll in front of him was one of the scrolls that he bought. But when Soren looked at the spell scroll in front of him, he suddenly felt a little confused because he couldn't understand the symbols on it. This seemed to be a spell scroll from the time of the Arcane Empire, and it used some kind of spell code that was more difficult to understand. This kind of scroll was like an anti-theft code. You could activate it to use it, but it was very difficult to copy it. It didn't seem simple. This was the first thought that came to Soren's mind. Because there was no need to use a spell code for a third circle spell, unless it was a very special and powerful spell, or someone's unique spell. Spells were not static. Many times there were innovations and changes, but most of the spells that were passed down were the same. Unique spells were rarely passed down, and some of them were even lost. For example, the spell Mordenkainen's Sword, that was very commonly used by wizards. This 7-circle spell was originally a unique spell, and later it gradually spread to the hands of other wizards. Couldn't understand it? No problem. Soren could take it back and study it slowly. Besides, Vivian was right beside him. Just because he couldn't understand it didn't mean that Vivian couldn't understand it. Soren carefully picked up the spell scroll, then handed it to the little girl next to him and said in a deep voice, "Vivian, see if you can understand the symbols on it. This seems to be a special spell scroll." The little girl heard him and took it. Then she frowned and looked at it. Then she whispered, "Brother, it's full of spell code. I can't understand a lot of it, but I know the name of this spell. Melf's Minute Meteor. This seems to be a third circle spell. It actually uses meteor as its name. It seems to be very powerful." Melf's Minute Meteor? When Soren heard the name of this spell, his whole body couldn't help but tremble. Then there was a hint of surprise on his face and he murmured, No wonder. It's actually this spell. No wonder it needs to be recorded in secret. Third circle god-slaying spell. The legendary Melf's Minute Meteor. The reason why Soren was so impressed by this third circle spell was very simple. It was because someone used it to successfully slay a god. He killed the first demigod lich that appeared during the Avatar Crisis. He was also the first demigod lich to be killed in a cross-level challenge at that time. Melf's Minute Meteor became famous because of this. It almost became the #1 cross-level challenge spell among the low-level spells. It was also the only low-level spell that could break the force field of the divine law. Melf's Minute Meteor, Evocation, Alteration. The caster creates miniature meteors in his hand. This energy creation is regarded as a +5 rare weapon. It can cause 3+ spell power explosive damage to the target, as well as an additional 3 points of fire damage. The number of miniature meteors created is equal to casting level +1. Before all the miniature meteors are consumed, no other weapons can be used to fight. A spell that didn't look very impressive. In terms of damage, it was not comparable to the Fireball spell at all. This was because the Fireball spell of a high-grade caster could reach nearly 100 points of spell damage. But there was a very special thing about Melf's Minute Meteor, it was a magic creation and was regarded as a +5 rare weapon. Even the Demigod Lich was not immune to the explosive damage caused by it. In terms of damage penetration, even the Icing Death in Soren's hand was not as good as Melf's Minute Meteor, so it was also called Dragon Slaying Meteor. Because it could break the dragon's dragon scale protection, the effect was similar to a grenade explosion. Wherever it hit the dragon, there would be a small dent there. Finally, another reason why it was sought after by countless people at that time was that it was really cool when it was cast. The caster's hands would be wrapped in flames, and then 2 small meteors would be formed in the palm of the caster's hand. When attacking, the caster would throw the meteors. The meteors that were shot out would roar out and explode violently after they touched the target. At the same time, the caster's hands would automatically generate new meteors until the number of meteors that could be created by the spell reached the limit. One could imagine the scene of the adepts hurling meteors down from above. It was really cool. Unfortunately, this spell was not so easy to learn. It had always been a rare spell. Chapter 281. Melf's Minute Meteor. The biggest significance of this spell for Soren was that it could break through the defense of almost any enemy, whether it was a dragon, a demon, a devil, a demigod lich, or a god descended from a saint. Melf's Minute Meteor could break through the protective force field on their bodies and cause a certain amount of damage to these enemies. Perhaps the damage was not high because these enemies had quite a terrifying damage reduction, and some could even reach more than 90%. However, as long as it could cause damage, it meant that the enemy could be killed. The last thing that was needed was a tactical arrangement. In the past, many guilds joined forces to slay the gods, and they used this grade 3 spell to open the way. Pure-blooded dragons were immune to most physical attacks that did not have armor-piercing properties. High-grade demons and devils were immune to ordinary weapon attacks. In theory, demigod-level liches could be immune to at most +3 rare weapon attacks, and the gods who descended in the form of saints could be strengthened by the power of the law. Only rare items of +5 or above could break through their protective field. After all, legendary items were too rare. There were even fewer weapons that could reach the legendary level. These weapons were all famous equipment, and most of them were in the hands of powerful storyline natives. Therefore, the ability of Melf's Minute Meteor to break through the defense had a strategic position. And the damage reduction of this spell was very little, and it could cause full damage to many enemies. Therefore, it was also known as the easiest god-slaying element to obtain. For Soren, getting the scroll of Melf's Minute Meteor was a complete surprise. Because this spell could cause full damage to the spirits. In theory, it could break through the defensive force field of a demigod spirit and eventually kill some demigod spirits that were difficult to deal with. In addition, it belonged to a spell that was close to being lost. It was born before the Arcane Empire, and it was still in the hands of a few wizards. Soren carefully put away the scroll. Then he looked at Vivian in front of him and motioned the little girl to go out with him. The nearby buildings were connected together, but they had already been damaged quite badly. There was basically no breath of life here. Soren walked around a little, and after finding no other hidden compartments, he approached the wizard tower. It was very troublesome to search the entire ruins carefully. Soren didn't have so much time now, so he could only explore the situation here first. It was unknown when. There was a trace of gray mist rising nearby. When Soren walked to the periphery of the settlement, he could not help but tremble. Because he saw a round ball. No. It shouldn't be called a sphere but a cover. It looked like a glass cover and inside it was a wide shelf. There was a skeleton on the shelf, but it didn't look like a human. It had sharp fangs, thick bones, horns on its head, feet like a cow, and a pair of bone wings extending from both sides of its spine. Soren recognized what it was. Because he had seen this kind of skeleton several times in the past, but it was all in the abyss of hell. In front of him was a demon skeleton, and it was a high-tier demon that was hard to deal with. If Soren remembered correctly, it was one of the hardest demons to deal with, the Baler. Challenge rating 16, creature level 21 and above. Large otherworld creature, chaotic, transdimensional, evil. It was a creature on the same level as a dragon. The Baler that Soren was familiar with was one of the strongest Balers. Who is the owner of this wizard tower? Soren couldn't help but stop, and at the same time reached out to stop the curious Vivian. He whispered, "It's the skeleton of a Baler, and it looks like it's been dead for a long time. The owner of this wizard tower should be a very powerful legendary arcanist. This Baler was obviously captured or summoned by him, and then forcibly imprisoned inside. He hadn't even gotten close to the wizard tower, and he already saw this thing." Soren's heart sank, and he felt that everything in front of him was beyond his ability to deal with. A legendary wizard. A very terrifying existence. A legendary arcanist. An existence that was comparable to the gods. If someone told Soren that there was an army of golems in this wizard tower, he would probably believe it. This was because the battle that made the legendary sword saint famous, the Battle of Golems, was because someone accidentally activated the defense mechanism of a high-grade wizard tower. At that time, there were more than 10 diamond golems, more than 100 steel golems, more than 100 puppet golems, as well as hundreds of clay golems, stone golems, and iron golems. Let's stop here. Soren stood in front of the skeleton of the Baler for a long time, and then said in a low voice, "Vivian, let's stop here. I have a bad feeling that the danger here is beyond our expectations. It's best to wait for Gloria to come. After all, she knows more about the wizard tower than we do. Maybe she can enter without activating the defense mechanism." They couldn't just barge in. Neither Soren nor Vivian could be sure that there was a defense lock here. To put it simply, they didn't know enough to tell if there was something like an 8 trigrams formation in front of them. If they rushed in recklessly, they might be hit by a disintegrate spell or be teleported into another dimension. The simplest way to understand the defense lock was that it was a fantasy version of the 8 trigrams formation. If you couldn't find a way out of the formation, you could only force your way out. "Brother, look over there." Vivian nodded her head lightly. Although there was another voice in her head that was clamoring that a mere Magus tower was nothing, and that she could destroy it in a matter of minutes, the little girl still forcibly suppressed the arrogant troublemaker who did not know the immensity of heaven and earth. Vivian's intuition told her that there was danger ahead. She would never allow Lillian to rush in recklessly. The little girl looked around, and as the fog in front of her faded a little, she seemed to have seen something. "Brother, the plants over there are strange." "Plants?" Soren heard her and looked over. His eyesight was not as good as Vivian's. It was not a matter of vision but the difference in strength between the two. Soren still used the eyes of a mortal to see things, but Vivian used the vision of a saint to see things. The power of divinity could see through some of the fog. However, Soren now also had a weak divinity. He gradually saw through the fog in front of him and saw some strange plants. They were very familiar. Because these plants were very similar to the mutated man-eating plants he saw in the material plane. They didn't grow randomly like in the material plane. Instead, they were more like fixed in certain areas. If the picture of their growth and distribution was like something, Soren felt that it was like a man-made garden, where the owner planted them in different places in the garden. In front of him was like the front yard of a mansion. Chapter 282. Big Brother? Vivian narrowed her eyes and carefully observed the area in front of her. She then signaled Soren to carry her and said in a crisp voice, "Big Brother, carry me. I think I saw a small path over there. It's to the left of the garden, near the pile of rocks. I think there's a small path over there, but I don't know where it leads to." "There's a small path." Hearing this, Soren immediately picked up the little girl next to him, and then directly put Vivian on his shoulder. A pair of small feet stepped on Soren's left shoulder, and then a small white hand wrapped around his head. After carefully observing that side for a while, she whispered, "We can go around from the left. There doesn't seem to be any fog there, but we don't know where it leads to." The fog in front of them should be part of the defense lock. Just like how there was fog in the 8 trigrams formation, many defense locks would have corresponding illusions. These illusions could only be seen through by the golden gaze fiery eyes. Otherwise, it could only be dispelled by spells, special abilities, and divine power. It seemed like the power here had weakened a lot. Otherwise, a real defense lock would create illusions instead of just fog. Even a defense lock, set up by a lich, could create a dark sky canopy, let alone one set up by an arcanist. "Let's go." Soren didn't hesitate for too long. He immediately said, "Let's go around and take a look." He didn't dare to enter the defense lock, directly because he was careful, cautious, and worried about Vivian's safety. However, if he didn't even dare to explore the side entrance, then he didn't have the courage to take the risk. Taking a risk was always risky. Soren knew that the risk wouldn't exceed the limit of his strength, not that he didn't dare to take any risks at all. It seemed like the path on the side had been destroyed by time. Even if there was any danger, it wouldn't be more dangerous than going through it directly. This way he could also estimate the difficulty of going through it directly. Be careful. Soren put little Vivian down and began to pay attention to the surroundings. He even tapped the ground with the tip of his foot from time to time. He was detecting if there were any traps nearby. Logically speaking, there shouldn't be any, but he still felt that it was necessary to be more careful. The path passed through the corner of the garden. There was a pile of broken stones on the side. There were no strange plants nearby, but there were traces of cracks on the ground. Sauron looked around and whispered, "Vivian, you're right. Don't you think this road is a bit like the road to the backyard?" This was Soren's intuition. Judging from the layout of the surroundings, this was the front yard of the wizard tower. Since the path was from the side, it looked like it led to the backyard or to the kitchen or something like that. Arcanus had a large number of servants, unlike wizards who only needed golems to serve them. During the time of the Arcane Empire, wizards were the ruling class. Other than having a large number of servants, they also had a certain number of followers. A little. Vivian nodded gently. There seemed to be two different worlds in front of him. On the right was a strange garden surrounded by fog, and on the left was a ruin with many broken stones without fog. Soren took Vivian through the place carefully. When they walked about 300 meters, a well-preserved house appeared in front of them. This house had a very obvious feature, that was, it had a chimney. Generally speaking, houses with chimneys served the same purpose. Soren felt that he had guessed correctly at the beginning. "Brother." Vivian raised her hand and pulled Soren's sleeve, whispering, "It really looks like a kitchen." "Yes." Soren nodded gently and said, "Be careful. Let's go in and have a look." Creak. Soren pulled out his curved sword, icing death, and then gave Vivian behind him a look. Then he directly pushed open the door that had not yet decayed, and immediately there was a burst of dust. When Soren walked into the house with the little girl, he immediately found that it was covered with dust, nearly half a centimeter thick. No one knew how long it had been since a living person appeared. "Brother, look." After Vivian entered the house, she glanced around, then pointed to a chair in front of her and whispered, "There seems to be something over there." "Something?" Soren moved his feet alertly, then picked up a stone and threw it at the position of the chair. The force deflected it a little, and then they saw a rather short skeleton on the chair. The height of this skeleton was only about 1.25 meters, but the bones were quite thick compared to the height of the body, especially the position of the leg bones and the foot bones were larger. With such a bone shape, if an experienced person were to identify it, they would be able to tell at a glance what kind of creature it used to be. Soren glanced at it and whispered, "It's the skeleton of a halfling, maybe an Arcanist chef." Whoosh. Just as he finished speaking, a gust of cold wind suddenly blew through the almost sealed house. The cold wind caused people to shiver involuntarily. Then a series of sinister and strange laughter sounded. Undead? Vengeful spirit? Earthbound spirit? Soren's mind changed several times in an instant, then he protected Vivian behind him and said in a deep voice, "It's a spirit-type enemy. It looks like an earthbound spirit. Be careful. It should be watching us from the spirit realm now. Let's wait for it to appear before attacking." Undead-type enemies. The more common ones were the skeletal undead that they encountered in the outside world. This kind of undead had a body, so it was easier to deal with. The other kind was the one in front of them, which was born from ghosts and evil spirits. It belonged to the category of monsters without a body or a semi-energy form. This kind of undead was more difficult to deal with, and normal physical attacks did not have much effect on them. Kikik. Sad and strange laughter came from all directions. Soren's expression did not change, but Vivian seemed to be a little unhappy. She snorted and said, "I hate you undead the most. Get the hell out here." A faint light of magic appeared. Protection from evil. Vivian first cast a level 1 spell, Protection from Evil, and then continued to cast spells. Detect undead. An invisible light of magic appeared and covered the whole house in an instant. Then behind a wall, a shadow in the shape of dark red light appeared. Most of the undead creatures were dark red under the detection of magic, which meant that they were very evil. If it was a paladin, they would have to destroy them. Immobilize undead. Another light of magic appeared. Vivian raised her hand and pointed at the undead in the distance. Then a faint light appeared, followed by a shrill howl. All of a sudden, the undead behind the wall seemed to have gone berserk, and charged towards Vivian ferociously. The control spell had failed, and the enemy had passed the test of immunity, so Vivian was identified as the first target. Shang. The curved sword in Soren's hand was instantly unsheathed, and then he slashed at the half-illusory earthbound spirit. Shadow Strike. The legendary curved sword Icing Death had ice damage, which had a special effect on the undead. Although physical attacks were almost ineffective against it, the rogue's Shadow Strike was useful. It was a type of shadow energy damage. Soren's curved sword instantly hit the earthbound spirit that rushed over. It felt like hitting cotton candy. The blade directly passed through the earthbound spirit's body. Only the ice energy and shadow energy hurt the earthbound spirit. The physical damage caused by the attack was estimated to be 1 or 2 points. Fear, instant cast. As a high-level undead creature, the earthbound spirit had a very special ability. It could instantly cast a fear-type spell. It could be intimidation, fear, or even a spell like the Robe of Fear. However, when the earthbound spirit in front of it threw out the fear spell, it was a little dumbfounded because the two people in front of it seemed to completely ignore the fear spell. There was no need for them to pass the test of fear at all. Yes, they directly ignored the fear spell. There was no need to mention Vivian. She was the son of fear, so how could she not be immune to a mere fear spell? As for Soren, his resistance to the fear spell was also quite high. Not to mention his accumulated strong will, just absorbing the divinity of fear was enough to make him immune to the fear spell cast by non-legendary enemies. Dominate humans? The earthbound spirit in front of them seemed to have a certain level of intelligence. After knowing that the fear spell did not work, it immediately changed its tactics. It cast a talent spell, Dominate Humans, trying to control Soren, who looked like a warrior, and then use him to kill the little girl who made it feel dangerous. However, it miscalculated again because the Dominate Humans it cast did not have any effect at all. It was directly immune to Soren's strong will. What a joke. He had experienced so many storms along the way, how could he be easily controlled by others? Didn't Soren walk barefoot for thousands of miles in order to be able to deal with the current situation at all times? As long as his will was strong enough, he would be immune to most charm, mind, and control spells in the future. This was very important for a rogue whose immunity was lower than a warrior's. A will as strong as steel. This was the most important factor for Soren's survival. So when he successfully resisted the Dominate Humans, cast by the earthbound spirit in front of him, a trace of killing intent appeared in his eyes, and he once again swung his sword at the enemy in front of him. Shadow Strike. Chapter 283. The curved sword once again went through the enemy's body. Although the earthbound spirit's body wasn't made of flesh and blood, it felt as if he was cutting through jelly. He didn't feel any force at all. However, the shadow energy condensed by Shadow Strike still affected its body, and at the same time, the legendary curved sword Icing Death stained it with a cold silver-white color. This was because Soren's weapon was not high-end enough. With a weapon enchanted with advanced elements, it could easily take away half of the earthbound spirit's HP. Summon the undead. Phantom Mirror Image. After being hit several times by Soren and suffering from Shadow Strike twice, the earthbound spirit finally felt the threat of death. A strange light of magic appeared in its eyes, and then its figure split into 5, becoming 5 almost identical figures that appeared in the same place. This was not the wizard's shadow creation, because shadow creation made the same movements and could only be used to confuse lower-level enemies. However, the earthbound spirit in front of them turned into 5 phantoms that made completely different movements. It was almost impossible to recognize them at a glance. Creak. The sound of bones trembling could be heard in the house. In the small room that Soren did not go in to check, there was a series of strange sounds. Then, skeletons appeared one after another. Among them there were large and small skeletons. There were almost no skeletons of the same race. After they woke up, their pupils emitted the light of the undead, and then they rushed out to Soren and the others in front of them. "Brother, get out of the way." Vivian's voice sounded behind Soren. When he heard the little girl's voice, Soren immediately jumped back without hesitation, and at the same time, lifted the table with his foot to block in front of him, because he felt a burning breath behind him. When Soren lifted the table in front of him, Vivian also raised her hand and cast a fireball. Boom! There was a violent explosion. The whole house shook as if it was going to collapse. Fireball was not to be underestimated. After all, it was also a grade 3 spell. When a high-grade wizard cast it, it was almost as lethal as a howitzer. Back then, the 5 Fireballs Divine Sect had used it to open up a path. Even the city gates had been blown up. The heat wave from the explosion spread out. A crater appeared on the ground, and the flames ignited the other things in the room. Some of the things that were relatively well preserved were immediately set ablaze. But this was just the beginning. Vivian didn't stop after casting the first fireball. She immediately threw out the second fireball and then the third. By the time the little girl's continuous fireball spell ended, the scene in front of them was about to turn into ruins. The undead summoned by the earthbound spirit were all dead, and there were only 2 illusions left, both of which were about to dissipate. Harvest it! Soren's eyes lit up. He was ready to take advantage of this opportunity to kill the enemy and gain some slaughter EXP. However, Vivian reached out to stop him. Brother? The little girl shouted and said hurriedly, "Don't kill it. I'll imprison its soul. It seems like it still retains a certain amount of intelligence. Perhaps there's a way to get some information about the Adept Tower from it?" Soren withdrew his sword in an instant and almost brushed past the earthbound spirit as he retreated. Imprison its soul? This was a very difficult thing to do. Although there were many supernatural powers in this world and there were many powerful gods and so on, the realm of the soul was still a very mysterious and unknown thing in this world. Any spell related to the soul was at least a level 5 spell, and any spell related to the soul was at least a level 7 spell. There were even some special spells that could only be cast by legendary wizards. Soren's soul was in a weakened state, and it required a level 5 restoration spell to repair it. One could imagine the power needed to touch the realm of the soul. Vivian's power was enough. She should now be a legendary sorcerer and a low-grade wizard, which was undoubtedly very powerful in terms of power. But when did the little girl learn soul spells? In Soren's memory, it seemed that Vivian had been sleeping recently. Occasionally she would read books or practice her spell-casting ability. She didn't learn many spell scrolls, so how did she suddenly learn soul spells? Hold the undead. Vivian's movements were very careful. She still used Hold the Undead, again in the face of the violent earthbound spirit. This time the earthbound spirit did not pass the immunity and directly stayed stiff in place. Clap. The little girl patted her white little hands, and her expression seemed to be a lot more relaxed. She said in a crisp voice, "Brother, there's no problem now. It can't move for the time being. We have to quickly find something that it used when it was alive." Something that it used? Soren frowned, then walked in the direction where he found the skeleton. He looked around, picked up the skeleton, and finally threw a wine bottle that looked like an iron kettle to the little girl. He looked around carefully and wondered, "Is this okay?" I found it next to his body. Halflings were addicted to alcohol. Thinking about Aladdin's alcohol tolerance, one would know that they actually liked to drink very much. Vivian reached out and took a look. Then a light of magic appeared on her fingertips and she said happily, "Yes. It's something that it used when it was alive." Soul Shackle. Vivian began to cast quickly. This time the spell was very long and took nearly half a minute. During this time, there was a lot of demonic language that Soren could not understand at all. However, he could still see the effect of the spell. He saw a soul mark appear on the wine bottle, and then Vivian raised her hand and pointed. Some kind of demonic power began to work, turning the earthbound spirit in front of them into a soul form, and then sucked it into the wine bottle in front of them. "Okay." Vivian patted her little hands and said in a crisp voice, "It's a pity that I don't know Soul Shackle. Otherwise I can just use a gem to imprison it." "Brother. We can interrogate him now." The little girl picked up the jug and snapped her fingers. Then a translucent soul shadow appeared in the room. It was a halfling with a long beard. He seemed to be in a daze and didn't seem to have much consciousness. When he was summoned by Vivian, he began to be in a daze. After a while he suddenly said, "Master. I was wrong. Master. Don't punish me. Please. Don't punish me." "What happened? Where did Master go?" "Run. Everyone run." Chapter 284. Memories of death. When Soren saw the scene in front of him and heard the words of the undead, he had already realized what was happening in front of him. This was because he had seen such a scene before. When an undead was restored to its soul form, it was possible for it to recover part of its memory. At this time it would remember some things. This kind of memory was mainly focused on the period before death because the soul could only remember very few things. This situation was a bit like when a soul entered the abyss of hell and was reincarnated, it would also forget part of its memory in the material plane. Souls were similar to currency for many beings. Many low-level demons in the abyss and the Bator Inferno were reincarnated from the fallen souls in the material plane. Only the worst souls and those who had given up on themselves would be directly sent to the river Styx. Of course, this kind of reincarnation was to reshape the soul. If anyone had seen paper making, they would have a deep impression of it. The souls were directly piled up, then crushed into powder and finally sent to the machine to make new sheets of white paper. The voice of the earthbound spirit gradually faded. He seemed to have remembered something and suddenly began to cry. After crying for a while, his expression became dull again. He just stared at Vivian and Soren in a daze. He didn't retain many memories because he had died a long time ago. Some people always couldn't tell the difference between souls and undead. In fact, the two couldn't be classified as the same. A soul was a pure body of energy. A soul could become an undead, but an undead wasn't a pure soul. Almost all undead were close to evil because they were born with a strong obsession. This obsession was often full of aggression and resentment towards the living. Therefore, most detection spells would be close to blood red when they encountered an undead. Undead were existences that violated the rules of death, but souls were part of the rules. Strictly speaking, the rules here might be longer than the teachings of many gods. But in a simpler way, the earthbound spirit in front of them was an undead in the beginning. Now he was a soul that had lost most of his memories. Expiation. Perhaps this word was simpler to describe. Vivian's transcendence was not a kind and righteous release, but a forceful and tyrannical method to seal the soul. It was equivalent to killing the part of the soul that belonged to the undead, and sealing the part that belonged to the soul in the wine pot. Therefore, the soul in front of him was considered to have been transcended. As long as the spell sealing it in the wine pot was removed, its soul could return to the river Styx. This kind of soul had already lost too much of its power, and it was difficult for an impure soul to have too many choices. Death is not necessarily the beginning. Pure souls, regardless of whether they were good or evil, would always have new opportunities placed before them. Brother? Vivian picked up the iron jug and glanced at the undead in front of her. What's your name? The undead, Vivian sighed and looked at Soren. It even forgot its own name. It seems like it has really lost itself. I don't know how much it still remembers from the wizard tower. Forgetting his own name. This meant that the soul was about to lose itself. Names were very important, so Vivian's first question was this. Vivian held the jug and continued to ask, where is this place? What's around here? How do I get to the wizard tower? The undead, the little girl asked 3 questions in a row, but the undead was still in a daze. She couldn't help but feel a little discouraged. This made her feel that her initial decision was wrong. This undead was completely useless after its soul was sealed. It didn't remember much at all. Even the memories of its death were just a bunch of mindless words. Give me the jug. Soren spoke at this time. He gestured Vivian to give him the jug, then held it and asked, where's the kitchen? The jug was a phylactery. It was something similar to a phylactery. Only by holding it could one control the undead in front of them. Compared to Vivian's question, Soren's question was the simplest one. It was so simple that it seemed useless. Thus, under the little girl's puzzled gaze, the undead in front of her was a little stunned. It then led Soren to the second room at the back. There were 3 rooms here, which should be the kitchen, the storage room, and the last room of unknown use. Soren nodded with satisfaction and followed it. He seemed to have noticed the little girl's puzzled expression, so he opened his mouth and said, it seems that he was indeed a chef of the Adept Tower when he was alive. If the Arcanist who once owned this Adept Tower was not a crazy researcher who only needed to use magic to create food to satisfy his needs, then he must have needed a chef. During the Arcane Empire, life was all about luxury and pleasure. This wizard tower is one of the typical examples. All the buildings nearby were built for the servants of the Arcanist. Vivian was only 9 years old this year after all. Soren said so much to guide her thoughts and use practical actions to teach her how to deal with things. The undead stopped in front of the second room. Then its expression became blank again. However, Soren seemed to be thinking about something. He looked around and continued, prepare the food. After hearing Soren's words, a slight change appeared in the undead's eyes. It then began to move mechanically. In fact, it didn't pick up anything. It was just repeating the action of making food. In the end, it even filled up a pile of air like it was holding a plate. As the chef of the wizard tower, what he did the most was preparing food. Therefore, it was the easiest thing for the undead to remember. Even if it had almost forgotten, the instinctive habit would still be branded in the depths of its soul. Just like the undead guards in some places, they would still patrol the ruins even after they had forgotten everything. This was what Soren had learned in the past. Very good. Soren smiled and said in a deep voice, "Send the food up." The critical moment had arrived. This house was built independently on the side of the wizard tower. It wasn't directly connected to the wizard tower. In fact, it was impossible to build a kitchen next to the wizard tower. Just thinking about it made one feel uncomfortable. Therefore, there must be a path to the wizard tower. This path should be quite safe. It should avoid the defense mechanism and the defense mechanism. The undead was stunned for a moment. Then its expression changed. It stopped for a moment and walked towards the back door as if it was carrying something. "Hurry up and follow it." Soren quickly called out to Vivian and said in a deep voice, "It should be taking the safe path. Let's follow it and remember the path to the wizard tower." According to normal eating habits, a person needed to eat 3 meals a day. Even if it was only 1 meal a day, the undead must have walked this path thousands of times before it died. Therefore, even if it had lost its memory, it could still remember the path. The two of them quickly followed after him. After the undead walked out from the back door, it immediately entered the area covered by the fog. However, it was at the edge. Soren and Vivian followed closely behind it. When it moved, the two moved. When it stopped, the two also stopped. At the same time, Soren used his eidetic memory to memorize the path and the surrounding environment. He was also prepared to fight at any time. However, they didn't encounter any battle. The two followed the undead for about 200 meters in the fog. Then they seemed to have passed through a corridor. Everything in front of them opened up. They arrived in front of the wizard tower. At this moment, they were less than 30 meters away from the wizard tower. They could clearly see the traces of time on the tower. There seemed to be a side door on the left. The undead didn't stop. It directly walked towards the side door. Because of its different form, it directly went through the door. Soren immediately followed it. He wanted to see if he could open the door. However, Vivian immediately reached out and pulled him back. Her small face was full of seriousness and she said in a serious voice, "Brother, be careful. There seems to be something behind the door." As soon as the little girl finished speaking, with a creak, the heavy side door in front of them opened. Then they saw the undead walking up the stairs. However, it didn't move at all. There was also a creature that looked like a construct. Its body was made of metal parts. Beside it were 2 huge and heavy diamond golems. When they noticed Soren approaching, they simultaneously came to life and approached the side door. Soul scan. It looked like a mechanical construct. Its head was golden. It seemed to be mixed with adamantine and other materials. In its eye sockets were 2 golden gems. After discovering Soren's presence, 2 rays of light shot out and enveloped them. At the same time, it said in a metallic voice, "No soul imprint left. An unauthorized visitor. Alert level 1 alert. Anyone who approaches without permission will be treated as an intruder. Thaling number 7 has taken over command. Construct spawn activated. Target 1's danger level is E. Target 2's danger level is C. No need to activate magic armor. Mana crystal pulse cannon decharging. Diamond golems activated. Activating order to expel or kill intruder. Diamond golems charged. Order activated." The series of changes was dazzling. There seemed to be a faint flash of light at the top of the wizard tower. It seemed that something had just turned. Then heavy footsteps were heard. 2 diamond golems that were about 3 meters tall and weighed more than a ton moved. Their eyes were shining with energy. They walked towards Soren and Vivian. Chapter 285. Shit. The corner of Soren's eyes twitched, and he pulled Vivian back almost immediately. At the same time, he handed the jug to her and said in a deep voice, "Summon that soul back. Let's retreat and leave this place first." Diamond golem. And there were 2 of them at once. It seemed like the defense mechanism of this place was beyond Soren's expectations. Under normal circumstances, the diamond golem was regarded as the top fighter of the wizard tower, but here it was the first tool to be used. One had to know that any diamond golem was a legendary construct, and it was also one of the most difficult golem to deal with. How difficult was it to deal with? Looking at the statistics in Soren's memory, he knew a thing or two. Diamond golem, golem, grade 5. Challenge rating 16, rune level 21, has spell-like abilities. Highest and lowest attributes 25, lowest attributes 10, total attributes 90 to 100. Special abilities: crushing damage, damage reduction, magic resistance, poison attack. Resistance statistics: 100 points of strong acid resistance, 100 points of cold resistance, 100 points of lightning resistance, 125 points of fire resistance. 90 points of crush resistance, 90 points of pierce resistance, 90 points of slashing resistance, 90 points of range resistance. Magic resistance 100. Damage immunity: immune to normal weapon attacks, immune to +1 rare weapon attacks, immune to +2 rare weapon attacks, immune to poison attacks, immune to backstab attacks. Difficulty A++. Diamond Golem. Under normal circumstances, it was the most difficult golem to deal with. It had around 90 points of physical resistance, and was immune to most physical attacks below 90 points. At the same time, it had more than 100 points of resistance to cold, acid, lightning, fire, and also 100 points of magic resistance. To put it simply, any elemental damage below 100 points or spell damage below 100 points would have no effect on them at all. They couldn't break through their defense at all. This was close to the highest level of golem. Only legendary wizards could create them, and they were very expensive because the core material to create them was diamond golem. It was also commonly known as diamond golem, the original body of a diamond. That's right. This was a golem that used diamond golem as its core material, and only the richest legendary wizards could create them. Damn it. That was why Soren ran away as soon as he saw them. With his current strength, even if he used all his strength, he would only be able to barely break through their defense. One could imagine the scene of him using a sword to cut a diamond. Then one could understand how powerless he was right now. This was an existence that made many rogues helpless in the past. They could only rely on the special terrain to find ways to exhaust them to death. But now there was certainly no way to use the terrain because the surroundings were quite empty, and it seemed that there was more than one enemy. Soren turned around and ran with Vivian. The little girl held the wine jug and chanted a sentence in the demonic language. Then she saw that the sluggish soul in the room disappeared, and a faint magic light appeared on the wine jug. Heavy footsteps could be heard coming from behind them. 2 diamond golems that weighed more than a ton stepped out. Soren didn't even need to look at them to know that their strength was over 25 points. Conservatively speaking, 3 of their attributes were over 20 points. Don't think that all puppet golems are heavy and slow. When you see the diamond golem, you will discover that it is running faster than you. Haste. Vivian obviously realized this as well. She raised her hand and cast a haste spell, then continued to cast another spell, grease. A greasy liquid suddenly covered the ground. Although this did not have any obvious effect, it still slightly affected their sense of balance at first, and then it was useless at all. Let's go. Soren picked up Vivian's petite body and then said in a deep voice, "Stone to mud is effective on them." They couldn't fight the diamond golems head-on. With their current strength they had little chance of winning. After all, in Gloria's wizard tower, there was only a batch of steel golems. In terms of strength, the steel golems were not even enough to carry the shoes of the diamond golems. Any diamond golem in front of them could break all the steel golems made by Gloria into pieces of iron. To deal with this kind of puppet golem that was close to the top, they could only use tricks. Go. The speed of the diamond golems was a little slower because the ground under their feet suddenly turned into a mud pit, and then their legs went down a little first, but they soon climbed out. Soren had already rushed out a short distance. When a fog appeared in front of him, he suddenly stopped and closed his eyes to think for a moment, then rushed directly into it. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. Soren's brain was like a high-speed supercomputer. What he saw in front of him was not just fog, gravel, and enemies, but pictures like pictures. The picture was the scene when the Revenant took them through the edge of the maze at the beginning. Everything that he saw was like a high-speed camera imprinted in Soren's brain. With the help of eidetic memory, encyclopedic knowledge, and sage, all of it was extracted at this moment. This was a very thrilling moment. Although it looked very normal, it was just Soren walking through the fog and running outside little by little. But in fact, if he took a wrong step, there was a possibility that he would trigger the defense mechanism of the maze, and then be directly trapped in the formation. Then, the two diamond golems would catch up with them. As for whether they could win in the end and what they would face after barely defeating the two diamond golems, these were all things that Soren could not predict. But fortunately, none of this happened. Soren's temporary memory was extracted at the crucial moment. Even if he only walked once, he completely remembered the route, and then successfully passed through the edge of the maze without triggering any defense mechanism. The sound of heavy footsteps was getting further away. When Soren returned to the original position of the house, a faint light flashed in the eyes of the two diamond golems, and then they turned around and returned to the side door. The target had been expelled. Their range of defense was around the side door, and Thaling 7 did not give them the order to chase after the target. Everything gradually calmed down. Soren hugged Vivian's petite body, took a breath, and then put her down. He turned around and looked at the wizard tower behind him, then reached out his hand and patted the little girl's head and slowly said, "Let's go. Let's leave this place. This is not a place that we can explore yet." Chapter 286. Under the Gray Sky. Soren carefully left with Vivian. In his mind, he had already listed the wizard tower in front of him as the most difficult challenge. The difficulty of this challenge would not be any easier than the saints who had descended to the mortal world. If the monsters on the first floor of the wizard tower could already encounter the diamond golem, Soren would not be surprised if he encountered the mana armor or construct spawn after entering the tower. Because the difficulty of this wizard tower was above level 25, some things were completely beyond Soren's expectations. Even he had never seen such a difficult wizard tower before. Unsurprisingly, it should exist for the construction of the floating city, because only the floating city required a large amount of thaling to maintain the operation of the floating city. A normal wizard tower only needed one thaling. Thaling was a special life form, a bit like the interstellar era's artificial intelligence. It was a soul construct spawn, and its strength level was basically above level 21. It could control various areas of the wizard tower, and when necessary, it could replace the wizard to direct the operation of the entire wizard tower. The signature feature of a high-level wizard tower was the thaling. For example, Gloria's wizard tower did not have a thaling in it. Otherwise, it would not have been attacked by the Hand of Despair. Therefore, her wizard tower could only be considered as an incomplete low-level wizard tower. There were some moving shadows on the empty grassland. These shadows were not very aggressive, and they were souls that had just been transferred to the shadow plane. Among them, there might be some aborigines that died under Soren's hands. The destination of souls was full of randomness. Although most of them entered the Styx's reincarnation, there were still many souls that passed through the plane barrier and entered other dimensions, including the creatures of the four major elemental planes. Many of them were formed by souls that entered the material plane. However, in that case almost all of their memories were lost and in the end only their elemental consciousness was left. Don't worry about them. Soren looked up at the sky, secretly calculated the time and then said, "Let's find an exit or else we'll be trapped here for a day." Interplanar teleportation required coordinates. Vivian was at a disadvantage in this aspect because she had only learned magic for a short time. The two of them began to search for the shadow crevices. Occasionally they would encounter some ghosts that were attracted to them, but Soren would kill them with a single slash. These newly born shadow beings were very weak and gave very little slaughter EXP. One of them only gave Soren 120 slaughter EXP. They walked around the place they came from and suddenly heard something. Soren immediately went into stealth mode and signaled Vivian to cast an invisibility spell on himself. Thump 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 thump. He couldn't tell what the sound was, but it gradually became the sound of wings flapping in the wind. From the sound, it seemed that the creatures approaching were very large and there were many of them. Otherwise the sound wouldn't be so obvious. Soren led Vivian to a secluded corner, and the two of them looked up at the sky at the same time. Shadows began to appear above their heads, and they gradually approached the wizard tower. "It's a shadow raven." Soren frowned and looked at it with a serious expression. He then explained to Vivian in his arms, "It's one of the species that lives in the shadow plane. It has a certain level of intelligence, almost as smart as a chimpanzee. It's very difficult to deal with. It lives in some parts of the shadow plane and likes to live in large groups. Sometimes they even dare to fight with a shadow dragon." Shadow raven. What appeared in front of them was a huge bird that was 8 meters long with a wingspan of 6 meters. From the outside it didn't look much like a raven. It was a special kind of mutated life form. The origin of its appearance was unknown, but it was definitely related to the Arcane Empire. There were many taboo experiments that eventually led to the appearance of many mutated species. Shadow ravens had sharp beaks and claws. They lived in flocks in the shadow plane and were the top predators here. They were level 16 mutated creatures. A flock of shadow ravens dared to challenge an adult shadow dragon. The scene in front of them was a bit strange. The shadow ravens circled around the wizard tower, but they didn't dare to get close to the magic lock. They circled around again and again, making unpleasant croaking sounds, and then flew back to where they came from. This scene made Soren a bit confused, but he still remembered it. The shadow ravens wouldn't come here for no reason. There must be something here that attracted them. In addition, he further confirmed his guess. There must be some kind of anti-air defense mechanism near the wizard tower. Maybe it was the mana crystal pulse cannon. That was why the shadow ravens flew around the wizard tower but didn't dare to get close. Brother? Vivian stretched out her white little hand and patted Soren, whispering, I think I've seen that thing in a book. It said that it can be tamed into a flying mount. But they look so ugly. It's not cool to sit on them. Taming ravens? It seemed like something that could be done. It was similar to taming wyverns. But it was too time-consuming. Unless there was some kind of special inheritance, taming these creatures was not worth the cost. In the Orc Kingdom near the northwest, even if there were tens of millions of people, the number of wyverns that could be tamed was less than 300. These mounts could eat 3 sheep in a day. The cost of keeping them in captivity was quite shocking. Soren hadn't thought about this yet. To him, the most important thing was to build 2 fleets. The 2 of them waited for a while. After the flock of shadow ravens flew away, they continued to look for the shadow rift. Soren spent almost an hour to find the location of the shadow rift. Many of these rifts weren't fixed, unless a wizard built a stable teleportation circle. The 2 of them quickly returned to the material plane. Before leaving, Soren took a deep look at the wizard tower, then turned around and walked into the shadow rift. Vivian also looked at the wizard tower for a while, then clenched her little fist as if she had secretly made up her mind. In her mind, for the first time, Lillian was very honest and didn't act wildly. She also didn't clamor about how she could tear down the wizard tower in minutes. Perhaps she also realized that the difficulty of this wizard tower was higher than dealing with the demigod vampire. Note, Lillian likes to clamor about killing the demigod vampire. The scene in front of them gradually changed. Everything began to be colorful. After returning to the material plane, Soren squinted his eyes for a while to adapt to the changes in the surrounding colors. The sky in the shadow plane was gray. After staying in there for a while, it was visually shocking to see things outside. At this time the sky was still dark. It was estimated that it was about 4 o'clock in the morning. Soren gave a few instructions to his confidants, then took Vivian's little hand and went back. Brother. The little girl was very obedient and followed behind. After thinking for a while, she looked up and said seriously, This wizard tower seems to be very powerful. I've read a lot of books about wizard towers, but I've never seen such a thing, and the lowest level is actually guarded by a diamond golem. If we can control it, I'm afraid that except for the gods, no one can threaten us. Vivian also noticed it. After all, she had read a lot of books. Since Gloria owned a wizard tower, she naturally collected a lot of books related to wizard towers. Soren didn't answer this question. He was still not sure whether this wizard tower could fight against the gods, but he was very sure of one thing. With the current strength of the 2 of them, even if Vivian was a legendary sorcerer, the possibility of taking down this wizard tower was less than 1 in 10. Even if they invited Gloria, their success rate was still only close to 1 in 10. This wizard tower could be understood as a super dungeon with a difficulty of level 25. Soren's mind now was roughly like this. He was a half-baked rogue and he was barely equivalent to a legendary rogue. Vivian was a half-baked legendary sorcerer, and with the help of divine power she could barely meet the standard of challenge difficulty. Then there was no then. In the team challenge mode, the legendary warrior who was responsible for the meat shield was still nowhere to be found. The legendary wizard who was responsible for the overall control was not qualified yet. The legendary priest who was responsible for protecting the healer and taking over the warrior's position was even more difficult to find. They didn't meet the standard of this wizard tower at all, and even if they had enough people, the success rate was only 50/50. Vivian was right. This could indeed be a sorcerer's tower that could rival the gods. Soren's mind was constantly calculating, and at the same time trying to recall some important information, but there were still very few clues he could think of. In the end, he could only reach out and touch the little girl's head and slowly said, "Let's wait for Gloria to come. I believe that with such a wizard tower here, she should be happy to come and see it." He had to invite Gloria to come over. She was the real professional expert. A northern witch who had received formal wizard education was much better than them, who were only dabblers. Vivian looked up and said, "Brother, when are you going to invite Sister Gloria to come over? Can you take me with you?" Soren hesitated for a moment, then squatted down and touched the little girl's head. He said softly, "I'm afraid not this time. I'm going to go directly by sea in 2 days from the route of Shipwreck Bay to the north. After I leave, I need someone to guard this place. Maybe you need to stay here to deter those guys." "Vivian, can you do this well?" The little girl's face showed a hint of excitement and joy, then she nodded vigorously and said, "Yes. Brother, don't worry. With me here they will definitely be obedient." She was very happy, because she could finally help her brother like an adult, although she was only 9 years old this year. Chapter 287. Day 32 of Quitting Smoking, Willpower +1. Also, stop flirting with our deputy moderator. Her name is Nadi Xiang Tian. Finally, those who have votes can vote. The embodiment of justice, Stupa. There was a reason why Soren didn't let Vivian go with him. The Sons of Fear had the ability to perceive each other, and they could find each other after a certain distance, so Soren was a little worried about encountering the demigod vampire. He was now the most powerful Son of Fear, and he also had the form of a god. If they met him, there was almost no chance of winning. From this point of view, it was safest for Vivian to stay in the Outer Islands. After all, she was the first Son of Fear, and it could be said that she was the target that the demigod vampire wanted to kill the most. Seeing that they had already laid a foundation in the Outer Islands, Soren naturally didn't want to complicate things. As long as the base was established and then the drows were recovered, he could soon explore the outside world, and at the same time, make arrangements for Vivian to deal with the Dread Lord in the future. Although the demigod vampire was one step ahead of them in terms of situation, he was definitely not as good as them. As long as Soren's plan was successful, he would soon be able to overtake the other side. After all, the believers of the demigod vampire were vampires. From this point of view, it was an inherent disadvantage. The number of vampires could never be too many, which was not allowed by other forces. A day passed quickly. When Soren woke up the next day, there was a noise outside. He frowned and walked out, and then saw the half-elf first mate in front of him. Some of the men he sent out had returned, but the red-haired female pirate had not returned yet. The half-elf first mate brought back a lot of people, and behind him was a row of pirate minions carrying a lot of boxes, and then a group of shackled slaves, all gathered together. In addition, there was something that surprised Soren. It was a special cage, and there was a very petite figure in the cage. What was very eye-catching was that she had a pair of cat ears and a cat tail. Beast. Soren glanced at her in surprise and murmured, "Catwoman? It seems to be a beast that is close to extinction? Where did you find it?" The half-elf first mate bowed slightly, "Your Excellency. When we went back, we accidentally received some news. Then, we found that the people you needed were in the hands of another fleet. So we took them back." This feline girl was an unexpected discovery. She seemed to have been brought back from the eastern countries. "We're going to give her to Eldest Miss as a toy. Eldest Miss also needs a maid to serve her." Soren frowned when he heard that. He glanced at the feline girl next to him and looked away. Then he looked at the other pirates in front of him, mainly the slaves that were transported here. As an adventurer who had traveled across half of the world, Soren could tell at a glance that the slaves were of Eastern descent. Furthermore, from their facial features and hands, he could tell that many of them were Eastern craftsmen. Soren nodded and asked, "How's the harvest?" The half-elf first mate hesitated for a moment and then whispered, "We captured a group of slaves and seized 3 large ocean-going ships. The loot that can be quickly sold is about 24,000 kindler. Other valuable goods that are more difficult to sell, such as porcelain, tea, silk, and so on, are all stored in the warehouse on Snake Island. According to the manager's estimation, all the goods plus the 3 ocean-going ships should be worth about 120,000 kindler." Soren's face showed a trace of surprise, Then his expression became serious. He was surprised by the profit of this robbery. The return was a bit too high. Soren put his hands behind his back and turned a few times. Then, he pondered for a moment and looked up. Is it the pirate King Ashrod's goods? The half-elf first mate's forehead had a trace of cold sweat, then he carefully said, yes. Who gave you the information? Soren frowned slightly and asked. The half-elf seemed to tremble and his voice was a little nervous. It's the Amazon women. They secretly sent someone to tell me that the craftsmen you need are on those ships. Soren closed his eyes and paused for a moment, then raised his hand and patted the half-elf first mate on the shoulder and said in a deep voice, you did a good job this time. Although the behavior was a bit reckless. But to be able to bring back so much profit, I must give you some rewards. From now on, the 3 ocean-going cargo ships will be under your command, and then I will allocate some manpower to you. From today onwards, you will be in charge of the trade between Port Tylon and the outer islands. Don't let me down. The half-elf first mate's face showed a hint of excitement. He knew very well that he made the right bet. Originally he commanded 2 warships and now he had 3 more cargo ships. It could be said that his current status and subordinates had completely surpassed the red-haired female pirate. But he hesitated for a moment and still said with some worry, Your Excellency. We robbed the pirate King Ashrod's cargo ships. Will they retaliate against us? Soren nodded faintly and said slowly, possibly. But when we dealt with the Swamp King, he also robbed us of the spoils on the Devil Island. This account will be settled with him sooner or later. Now it's just a little interest. You robbed his goods this time, and it's possible that he will retaliate against us. Tell the others to be careful during this period of time. When the time is right, we will destroy them in one fell swoop. The half-elf first mate nodded with a dignified expression, and there was a trace of ambition and excitement in his eyes. If he could destroy the pirate King Ashrod, Soren would dominate the south coast. His status would naturally rise, and he would be under one person and above thousands of people. The people below quickly retreated. Soren sat at the table and pondered for a moment, then called in a person and gave a few instructions. The half-elf first mate had returned, but there was no news of Adele Isabella. It seemed that the development of the guano stone was not very smooth. This time, Soren may need to go in person, but he also happened to be going to the north. Maybe he could find a wizard who knew alchemy and could process the guano stone into high-quality fertilizer. In addition, this time, his subordinates robbed the pirate King Ashrod's cargo ship. He was afraid that the pirate king would not let it go easily, and he might even attack him. However, if he wanted to deal with a large number of people, he would definitely not be able to hide it from the Sea Temple. So Soren thought that the possibility of Ashrod sending people to assassinate him was the highest. He had to make some preparations in advance. No one would have expected that Soren would be so careful and prepared in advance because his subordinates robbed the pirate king. Chapter 288. The half-elf first mate brought back some people, and the number of people in the camp suddenly increased a lot. Soren went out to check the goods he brought back, and then he ordered his men to supervise the slaves. After dealing with these things he went back to his room and sat down. Soren closed his eyes and thought for a while, then he began to pick up a quill to write and draw. As a rogue, his fingers were quite steady. Even if he didn't use any tools when drawing, the straight lines he drew were like using tools. About 30 minutes later, Soren completed the first drawing. At a glance, one could see that it was an architectural drawing. The simple structure of the entire camp was drawn on it, as well as various internal and external layouts, including sewers, building distribution, statistics of the camp area, fence towers, and so on. After Soren finished all this, he began to write other parts, which were some of the construction arrangements and precautions. Among them, there were strict requirements such as sewers, toilet distribution and sanitation, as well as the division and construction of roads, etc. He specifically wrote them down in detail. The rainy season in the outer islands was very easy to accumulate water. If the town was built according to his requirements, if there were no specially designed sewers, then they would have to be prepared to deal with waterlogging. Sewers were actually very simple things. As long as they were properly distributed and dug deep, there would be no problem. The Roman period had a good understanding of this. But even so, many cities in this world didn't care about this simple point. So many cities were dirty, messy, and smelly. Although Soren wasn't a clean freak, he definitely didn't want his territory to become like that, especially the pirates who liked to urinate and defecate everywhere when they were drunk. so he had high requirements for hygiene. Even urinating was not allowed, and even the tools used to commit crimes were cut off. This was the outer islands, and the environment was more primitive and desolate than the mainland. If they didn't pay attention, it was easy to breed diseases. The pirates were better. They drifted on the sea all year round, and their bodies were strong, but the slaves were not. If an infectious disease happened, it would be a great loss. Note, currently lacking doctors and medicine. After drawing the map of the camp, Soren began to draw a house. It was not a beautiful house, nor was it his own residence. Instead, it was a simple brick house, the kind that was commonly seen in the countryside. The area of a brick house was about 50 square meters. The beam structure was quite simple. It was a one-story bungalow. In front of the house was a drainage ditch and a four-way road. He requested to build more than 300 such houses, a total of 3 rows of houses, about 100 in each row. These houses were mainly built near the west gate and the south gate. The north gate was still a wooden house for the slaves. These buildings all had space reserved for them, so there was no need to rush to demolish the wooden houses that had just been constructed. After Soren finished drawing the blueprints of the houses, he proceeded to draw the layout of the roads. It wasn't just the four-way roads in the camp, but also the distribution of roads outside the camp. He needed his subordinates to build a road that directly connected to the natural harbor. The length of this road was about 5 kilometers. Under the current circumstances, the length of the roads could not be too high. As long as the roads were flat and not full of potholes, it would be fine. In the future, when there was enough manpower and material resources, they could repair them again. What Soren drew was the route of the road, avoiding areas where dangerous creatures might be active. Next was a new piece of paper. This time, Soren didn't draw anything. Instead, he wrote a letter to the drow priest. The content of the letter was needless to say. After Soren finished writing the letter, he asked someone to call Dark Blade, Andri, and then handed the letter to him and asked him to arrange for someone to bring it back. At the same time, he also brought back a batch of supplies, mainly daily necessities. This time, the half-elf first mate brought back 3 ships of supplies, enough to support them for more than half a year. In fact, Soren's calculation was very accurate. After deducting the time needed for the current arrangements, he would be back in about a month. At this time, it would be the beginning of February. He could start to command the slaves to farm and then plant spring wheat for self-sufficiency. At that time, the camp would really have a firm foothold. As the leader of a force, Soren naturally couldn't come and go as freely as before. He took out the blueprints that he had prepared at the beginning. One copy was given to the half-elf first mate, who was responsible for the construction plan of the entire camp. The other copy was given to the one-eyed man, who was responsible for supervising the slaves' work. Finally, Soren came to another place where the slaves were held. He was ready to see the eastern slaves that were transported over. These people were all skilled craftsmen. Bang! Soren pushed the door open. The room where the slaves were held smelled very bad. There was an obvious stench. He waved his hand and signaled the people below to open the door for ventilation. Then he slowly walked in front of the eastern slave craftsmen and said in a deep voice, "Who can speak the common language?" Many of the eastern slaves looked at each other. As a wizard, Soren was unintentionally a failure because he knew too little language. The eastern slaves in front of him didn't seem to know much of the common language. They often used the desert language and eastern dialects. In theory, people who could speak many languages were knowledgeable. After all, this was an era where many commoners couldn't write their own names. In this era, being able to read was a sign of status. One could find a relatively easy job in the city that could support oneself. Even though most of the slaves in front of him were craftsmen, the language they knew was still limited to the east. They didn't know much about the common language here. Simply put, there was a language barrier between the two sides. No one knows the common language? Soren couldn't help but frown. He then asked his subordinates, "Does anyone know the Eastern language? I remember that someone went on the Eastern Ocean route." There was a short moment of silence. Then he saw that among the Eastern slaves, there was a middle-aged man in his 40s who stood up. He looked at Soren with some fear, then lowered his head and said, "Your Excellency, I know the common language." Soren glanced at him and immediately said, "Very good. From today onwards you will be their foreman. According to the customs of the mainland, since you fell into my hands as slaves, you are considered as my personal property. However, I am a very generous and benevolent person. As long as you work hard for me, I will give you the freedom you deserve." From now on, I will mobilize people to make brick kilns for you. Your next task is to make bricks, the more the better. Once you have burned 1,000,000 bricks, I will grant freedom to some of you." Soren paused for a moment. He looked at the middle-aged man who had a surprised expression and said in a deep voice, "Translate these words to them. You will be their foreman from now on. I will allocate a group of people for you. If I don't see satisfactory progress when I come back, your head will be hung on the flagpole outside." The middle-aged man was pleasantly surprised when he heard this. Then it turned into fear and he quickly nodded. These people were all craftsmen with skills. In this world, craftsmen were valuable, so Soren was much more tolerant of them. After waiting for the middle-aged man in front of him to translate, he called a small leader, gave a few instructions and left. Then other slaves began to be mobilized, and a group of capable pirates were in charge of supervising. Perhaps because Soren was very orderly, his minions gradually began to behave. Although there was not much discipline, it was much better than before. Because they were too presumptuous, they were all dealt with. Soren arranged things here and then went to see the indigenous slaves who were captured. During this period of time, about 30 people died. The cause of death was not because of escaping, but because of the way the drows controlled the slaves. This was a very complicated process involving criminal law, psychological suggestion, enslavement control, and so on. Some things were really not suitable to be said, but the general effect was still very obvious. That was, the indigenous slaves were now not so resistant to working hard every day in exchange for food. They did not work hard, but they did not slack off because they knew the terrible punishment for slacking off. A day passed quickly. Soren gave a lot of orders and made a lot of arrangements on this day. Anyone who saw the plan, even the pirate leaders, could feel that Soren was not just building an overseas base. However, they did not have any dissatisfaction. On the contrary, they were a little excited. After all, not everyone liked the wandering life of a pirate. With a foundation and a guarantee, at least they could leave something for their children and families in the future. Even if they were alone, they would not always like to live a life of uncertainty. Recently, some people in the camp had been discussing that His Excellency Throat Cutter's arrangements seemed to be preparing to develop the outer islands. If they could really develop here, if they had any injuries in the future, they might be rewarded by His Excellency Throat Cutter. In this way, even if they were old and weak in the future, they would have a foundation to support themselves. Maybe they could even be a small landlord or something. Many pirates were forced to enter this industry. Although there were many vicious and bloodthirsty people among them, there were also many people who longed for a stable life. Soren was quietly changing everything. Perhaps this change was not very obvious, but everything seemed to be in order. One day this change would amaze the whole world. Because a new force was rising. Chapter 289. The next day. Soren was ready to leave the camp and go to the north to invite Gloria. The Northern Witch was the only high-grade spellcaster that they had a good relationship with, and Soren had some unclear feelings for her. No one could tell when it started. Maybe it started when they encountered the believers of the god of hunting, or maybe it slowly developed over time. But one thing was for sure, Gloria, the Northern Witch, had a very high position in Soren's heart because she was one of the few people that Soren cared about. Strictly speaking, Soren was a very cold person. Being able to make a cold person care about her meant a lot of things. Vivian seemed a little sad about Soren's temporary departure, but she was still a child after all. After finding her new toy, she immediately became happy again. Because she had a new gift. It was a very cute cat girl. She was only 7 years old this year, 2 years younger than Vivian, but because of her race she looked about the same age as Vivian. This little cat girl was Vivian's maid. Although she was still clumsy and didn't know how to do anything, the little girl still felt that she could train her into a first-class maid. It was strange. This cat girl, who didn't show any kindness to anyone, even if Soren was close to her, would bare her teeth and pounce. But after meeting Vivian, she was unusually well-behaved, just like a domestic kitten. Maybe it was because they were about the same age and looked similar in size, or maybe it was because of Vivian's amazing charm. Anyway, the cat girl was very obedient after meeting her. She would do whatever she wanted her to do and play whatever role she wanted her to play. The little girl took out all the exquisite dresses that she had collected but had never worn before, and then changed her into them one by one. She even bathed her and dressed her up like a doll. It seemed that with this cat girl, Vivian would be very happy during this time. But what made Soren a little frustrated was that he originally thought that after Vivian tamed this wild cat girl, He could also see how she was different from ordinary people. But he didn't expect that after seeing him approaching, the little cat girl would immediately bare her teeth and pounce on him. Sure enough, different people were treated differently. People with high charisma would be more popular in whatever they did. No wonder so many lazy people chose the sorcerer as their core profession. Vivian had a playmate. Although she was not a normal human but a little beastkin, Soren was happy to see her. After all, the little girl was sometimes quite lonely. In the past, Soren rarely had time to accompany her because he had to survive. And he had no time to accompany her. Now there were countless things, and there was the coming Avatar crisis. It could almost be said that it was more difficult for Soren to rest leisurely with her. So having such a cat girl around the same age by her side should also make the little girl much happier. Yes, Vivian was much happier because of this playmate. This was because she had a playmate. Although she was a cat girl, the little girl still named her Lulu, because she couldn't speak yet. Other than her strange and incomprehensible pronunciation, she could only meow and shout loon loon loo. So her name was Lulu. Lulu was a very playful, obedient and well-behaved cat girl. She was also very cute. After she was cleaned, she looked very beautiful, like a delicate doll. People couldn't help but hug and pinch her. However, Vivian was also a little worried, because she was a little afraid that Lillian would play with Lulu until she broke. Recently, Lillian had apparently become more interested in this cat girl. Let's hope she doesn't mess around. Soren set off. But he didn't bring too many people with him. He only prepared a warship and secretly controlled the ghost ship. It would probably take nearly a month to go to and from the north because he had to go to Port Tylon and Shipwreck Bay to deal with some things. Soren was different from other pirate kings. He had strong control of the sea and had high requirements for his men. This time, he went to the north to invite Gloria, so he naturally had to arrange the things that needed to be dealt with. After all, no matter how strong his men were, they were still much weaker than Soren's own arrangements. Otherwise, the red-haired female pirate Adele Isabella would have returned by now. It seemed that she had failed. It was indeed difficult for a pirate to successfully persuade a proud wizard to cooperate with a pile of stones. If they were unlucky, it would be difficult to even meet. Sailing was a very boring thing. The first day passed uneventfully. Soren brought his men back along the original route. This situation lasted until the third day, when he saw something interesting in the exclamations of his pirates. Fish tide. Or more technically, it was the fishing season. Many fish here had the habit of migrating. In front of him were some fish that migrated in spring. Soren didn't know most of them, but he saw about 2 meters long fish that looked like hairtails. They had silver scales on their surface and were quite eye-catching in the sea. There were also things that looked like shrimps, which were a little different from the lobsters that Soren saw last time. He didn't know how many rich resources there were in this sea that had not been explored by humans. Look over there. The lookout on the battleship suddenly shouted, and then everyone looked in the direction he was pointing. Sharks. Soren saw a lot of sharks. The fishing season was a harvest season for the Aborigines, and for other creatures in the outer islands, it was also a harvest season. However, the sharkmen that appeared in the distance didn't seem to be fishing, but more like driving the fish in a certain direction. There were quite a lot of sharkmen. With Soren's eyesight, there were at least a few hundred of them. Among them, there were about 30 to 50 sharkmen that he had tamed. These sharkmen were active in the fishing season. From time to time, they would make strange cries or blow some kind of special conch shell. They quickly found Soren and the others. However, after a sharkman riding a sharkman came closer to observe, he avoided Soren's warship. The sharkmen were still busy, and the two sides passed each other peacefully. Soren silently watched all of this. His expression was deep in thought, as if he had thought of something. P.S. I like to write a relatively realistic world. Is this a quirk? Chapter 290. It was a rather boring 7 days. In fact, this kind of boredom was what others dreamed of, because if it was not boring, it meant that they encountered a sea monster. This was definitely a disaster in the boundless sea, and an important reason for blocking the trade routes of the outer islands. It turned out that Soren's initial decision to get close to the sea temple was correct, because with the support of the sea goddess behind him, not only did his warships not have to worry about deep-sea monsters, but even his other fleets did not have to worry about attacks from sea monsters. The only regret was that he had not been able to have an effective contact with the Sharkmen and the Naga Sirens. Naturally, there was no way to talk about deep-sea trade. If the profits of overseas trade were enough to make people take risks, then the profits of deep-sea trade were enough to make people ignore their beliefs. Unfortunately, deep-sea species were quite repulsive to land creatures. The 7-day route was not very long. Soren encountered a storm on the 5th day, but it was not very serious and would not affect their course. About the morning of the 7th day, Soren returned to the south coast, but his first stop was not Port Tylon, but Snake Island. Snake Island was now used as a storage base, with about 200 pirates stationed there for a long time. These pirates were all low-level thugs, and there was a small leader responsible for the security here. The real elites were basically brought to the outer islands by Soren. But this did not mean that the defense of Snake Island was weak. On the contrary, the defense here was better than other places, because there was a mutated giant tiger shark here. Soren first used the blessing of the sea goddess to control the giant tiger shark, not knowing if it was because it had killed too many people or because it had eaten too many people. Now it was obviously developing in the direction of a mutated sea monster, and because of the control effect of the blessing of the sea goddess, it had a feeling of obedience to Soren. This kind of control was stronger than its previous master, and because of the improvement of its wisdom, it could gradually distinguish between friend and foe. It was mutating into a magical creature. The giant tiger shark was about half the size of the past, and at this rate, it would eventually grow to the size of a warship. At that time, it would probably be able to overturn a warship like a giant octopus. Due to the strange perception of magical creatures and some kind of hidden spiritual connection, when Soren just returned to the waters near Snake Island, the giant tiger shark swam over from other places, and then emerged from the sea to meet him. It swam around the warship and seemed a little happy. Soren stood on the deck and watched the tiger shark swimming near the warship. He had a smile on his face, and after watching for a while he asked his men behind him, "Are there any sheep on the ship?" A pirate behind him turned and trotted to the cabin to ask, and then ran back and said, "Your Excellency, there are also 3 goats, half a deer and some other things." "Yes." Soren nodded and said, "Throw all the sheep down." 2 strong pirates came up with a sheep each. After they saw Soren nodding, they came to the deck. The 2 pirates looked at the giant tiger shark swimming near the warship with a face full of awe and fear, and then threw the 2 sheep down. The tiger shark had a very powerful blood-tracking ability. After it sensed the smell of blood in the water, it immediately swam over. Then it opened its mouth and swallowed the 2 sheep, and then quietly followed behind the warship. This giant tiger shark was raised freely. In the south coast where fish were abundant, there was no need for Soren to feed it. Feeding it was just to increase the intimacy. The tiger shark followed Soren to the vicinity of Snake Island, and then it gradually dived into the sea and swam towards the outside. It was now equivalent to a sea monster that occupied a part of the sea. It was active in the deep sea near Snake Island. Some time ago, some of his men saw it fighting with a giant octopus. At that time, the pirate leader below also ordered his men to help it. That was why Soren promoted the pirate leader to the steward of Snake Island. Until the giant tiger shark had completely left, the pirate sailors below were still talking about it. Their eyes were filled with awe and pride from time to time. It would not be long before some of them would brag about what they had seen and heard in the taverns of Port Tylon. There was no doubt. Pirates were also a group of people who liked to brag, especially when they drank too much, or when they wanted to attract the attention of a barmaid. The environment of Snake Island had changed a lot. First of all, the area it occupied was much larger. Since it was Soren's transit station and warehouse, of course, it had to have enough space. Snake Island was now the hub of the entire South Sea smuggling trade. Whether it was going to Port Tylon, the city of wealth, or coastal trade to Shipwreck Bay, Snake Island was a place they could not avoid. Smuggling by sea was the biggest source of profit for the South Coast. Because there were too many checkpoints in land trade, there were often guards and nobles who exploited the profits. Therefore, shipping directly by sea could save a lot of money and avoid most of the taxes. This business was like selling illegal salt. No matter what, there was a way to survive. As soon as Soren arrived at Snake Island, the pirate leader in charge immediately came to greet him. Soren did not remember the name of this man at all, but he remembered his physical characteristics very clearly. This pirate leader only had one ear, and the other ear was cut off by the enemy. Snake Island had been renovated several times. Now there were open roads on both sides that led directly to the camp. Some of the snakes at the back had been cleared, and now the snakes were mainly active in the south of the island. Soren glanced at the pirate leader who only had one ear in front of him and directly said, "Take me to the warehouse." The pirate leader in front of him immediately nodded and bowed, "Yes. Your Excellency, please come with me." The group quickly walked towards the warehouse. In front of them, a pirate guard opened the door of the warehouse and saw that it was full of things, all kinds of goods. It was easy for pirates to hoard goods because not all goods could be sold after they looted once. Only the goods that sold well could be sold through the black market merchants. The other goods might be overstocked for a while. After all, from an official point of view, almost all cities and kingdoms rejected the pirate black market. Chapter 291. Where's the goods from the east? Soren turned around and asked the people around him. Immediately, someone led him to the back. Soon, a pile of carefully placed goods appeared in front of him. Without even looking, one could tell that it was filled with porcelain. It was a very precious commodity. On the continent, exquisite porcelain was sometimes more popular than silver. At the same time, because porcelain was easily broken, it was easy to have accidents during transportation. Therefore, the price of exquisite porcelain had always been high. Although there were some porcelain crafts on the continent, only porcelain from the east was the best. Only authentic porcelain from the east could be sold at a relatively high price. It was just like how wine tasters like to pursue the origin of the wine. Why are there so many broken? Soren glanced at it and frowned. He said in a deep voice, "Almost all the boxes here are broken." Hearing Soren's words, the pirate leader behind him immediately broke out in cold sweat. He braced himself and said, "The idiot below was careless and fell when he was transporting it. I've already hung him up and gave him 20 lashes. If you're not satisfied, I'll punish them later." "Forget it." Soren waved his hand and said slowly, "Since they've already been punished, forget it." He looked at the porcelain in front of him and then turned to the box next to it containing spices, tea leaves and silk. The goods from the east were quite valuable. He came here not only to sell them, but also to bring some gifts for Gloria. In the past she helped Soren and Vivian a lot. In the past he didn't have the ability to express his gratitude to her. However, Soren was now one of the pirate kings of the south coast. This time he invited her to go overseas empty-handed. Courtesy demands reciprocity. In essence, Soren still had a lot of traditions from the past. Gloria probably wouldn't need the other gifts, but the spices, tea leaves and silk from the east were definitely useful to her. This was because wizards like spices and tea leaves. Many things that had the effect of calming one's mind were helpful for wizards to learn and understand spells. As for silk, it was needless to say. In this era where the overall level of civilization was close to the Middle Ages, silk was something that most women couldn't refuse. "Take all of these and transport them out." Soren glanced at them and picked out the best ones. Then he ordered his men to move them out. This batch of goods was quite high-end. Soren opened the two boxes and looked through them. He found a mermaid symbol in the corner of the box. Of course, this was not a mermaid. In fact, it looked more like a mermaid from the east. This thing was called a mermaid in the east. It was completely different from the fishman in the west. This symbol represented a very powerful force in the Eastern world. It controlled nearly 60% of the trade in the Eastern world. Whether it was goods transported through the desert on land or by sea, most of them had to be purchased from the cities under their control. This organization was quite strange. Soren had interacted with them before and there were many experts among them. In addition, these Easterners were not afraid of the drows at all. They were also one of the few humans who would trade directly with the underground drows, even if this kind of trade was relatively hidden and not many. Soren quickly picked out the gift. He didn't stay on Snake Island for long. After preparing the gift for Gloria, Soren took his men to Port Tylon. Now that he was back, he had to meet the Naga Siren priest. Otherwise she might be dissatisfied. If he didn't come to see her, she might think that Soren was arrogant. After all, she was the presiding priest of the south coast. In Port Tylon and the cities close to the mainland, the influence of the Naga Siren priest was still very strong. Soren still needed the power of the Sea Temple. It didn't take too much time to go to Port Tylon. In the afternoon, Soren arrived at Port Tylon with his men. The approach of the battleship did not alarm too many people, but there were still some leaders of the Chamber of Commerce who learned of Soren's return. Some of them were ready to come and meet him, just like how Soren wanted to meet the Naga Siren priest. As soon as Soren arrived at the port of Port Tylon, He ordered others to send his gift to the Sea Temple. Then he was ready to stay here for one night, and then set off for Shipwreck Bay. When it was time to send a gift, he still had to send one. Even if Soren forced the Naga Siren priest to give in and bow her head at the beginning, now that things were over, if there was a chance to ease the relationship, he still had to win her over a little. If Soren wanted to gain a foothold on the south coast, he must hold on to the golden thigh of the sea goddess. As long as he held on to the golden thigh of the sea goddess, even if it was a big thing, the Sea Temple would share some of the pressure for him. Soren was willing to serve the sea goddess. Wasn't it because he wanted to enjoy the shade under a big tree? Of course. It was not enough to just hold on to a big tree. Soren's ultimate goal was to make himself a big tree. As soon as the pirate who sent the gift left, the head of the Chamber of Commerce in Port Tylon came over and brought gifts one by one. These guys had a lot of eyes and ears. Pirates always liked to leak information, so it was not surprising that they knew about Soren's return. For the arrival of these guys, Soren knew clearly in his heart, because what they wanted was nothing more than the black market smuggling trade and a new route to the outer islands. These things could not be given to them. The reason why Soren did not attack merchant ships and was able to support so many of his men was because he had a firm grasp on the smuggling trade. The profit in it was quite amazing. Soren now had more than 2,000 pirates and Chamber of Commerce sailors under his command. These people ate and drank gold and silver from the smuggling trade. The protection fee at sea was not enough to support these people. As for the other route to the outer islands, Soren could not share it with them. In the future, this would be a way to make money. A meaningless greeting. Soren had a smile on his face as he dealt with people from all walks of life. He accepted all the gifts that were sent over, but he did not reply to any of them who wanted to inquire about overseas trade routes, or to probe into smuggling trade and so on. This attitude made many people helpless. Many people could only leave the gifts and leave with disappointment. Time passed like this for a quarter of an hour. When Soren finished dealing with the heads of these Chamber of Commerce, suddenly a strange figure appeared behind him. Then a cold light appeared, and a strange knife pierced through his back and directly hit Soren's heart. Blood splattered out of the wound. Soren's figure stiffened for a moment, and then his face showed a trace of pain. The knife pierced his heart. Chapter 292. No one knew when the assassin appeared. Even Soren didn't notice it. The enemy's strength was a little beyond his estimation. It wasn't until the moment before the enemy stabbed him that Soren realized that someone had ambushed him. His powerful dodging ability and amazing physical fitness made him want to avoid the attack from behind, but it was too late. Because he didn't have the ability, danger sense, the moment he was ready to dodge, the enemy had already stabbed him in the back. The tip of the sword pierced his back and it was impossible to dodge. At that moment, countless thoughts flashed through Soren's mind, but in the end, the will to survive dominated his body. When the enemy stabbed him in the back, he instantly activated Stone Skin, but the tip of the sword still pierced through his muscles and pierced his heart. At that moment, Soren could only activate Slaughter Transformation at the same time. Then, in the next moment, his body began to undergo a shocking change. His racing heartbeat squeezed out his blood, and in less than a millisecond his entire body's quality was greatly improved. Then he entered the Son of Slaughter form. The tip of the sword pierced his heart. Soren's body stiffened for a moment. The feeling of his heart being pierced was so painful that it made him lose some of his strength. However, the additional ability of the Son of Slaughter form had been activated. The person who assassinated Soren seemed to be a legendary assassin, because only a legendary assassin could get close to Soren without him noticing. However, as an assassin, the enemy's strength didn't seem to be high. The tip of the sword that should have pierced through Soren's heart was stuck after it pierced his heart under the effect of Stone Skin and Slaughter Transformation. His strength was exhausted. Soren's muscles clamped the enemy, and then when the enemy was about to twist the sword and crush his heart, a cold light appeared in the palm of Soren's hand. Then the legendary curved sword, Icing Death, appeared in his hand and directly slashed at the enemy's throat. This was a fierce counterattack. Obviously, the legendary assassin who tried to assassinate Soren hesitated for a moment. In his mind, Soren was almost a dead target, so he certainly didn't want to die together with Soren. So, the enemy took 3 steps back, pulled out his dagger and dodged Soren's attack at the same time. Tsk tisk. The assassin let out a mocking exclamation. From the outside, he looked like an ordinary sailor, but Soren knew that this was not the enemy's true face. In front of him was an assassin who was proficient in disguise. This was an uncommon type of basic skill. Compared to the disguise that could be removed by magic, this kind of disguise that relied on craftsmanship was more exquisite. The legendary assassin stared at Soren in front of him, licked his lips and said, "You're still alive after being stabbed in the heart. You really have a tenacious life force. No wonder that person was willing to pay me a high price to kill you. But how long can you last with this kind of injury?" The assassin's eyes were cold and full of murderous intent. He was also looking for Soren's weakness. This was because he felt a sense of danger when he transformed into the slaughterer. Soren's pupils turned blood red. Blood flowed out of his back, but the muscles he controlled temporarily stopped the bleeding. Soren would not die from excessive blood loss in a short period of time. He was now like the Knoll hunter who was successfully assassinated by Soren. At that time, Soren also stabbed the Knoll hunter's heart, but because the Knoll hunter's vitality was too tenacious and his constitution was more than 20 points, he did not die immediately. He held on for a while before dying from excessive blood loss. A row of blood-red data appeared. "You're under attack. You've been stabbed in the back by the enemy. You've received 126 piercing damage. You've received 21 shadow damage. You've been stabbed in the heart. You've triggered the test of death. You've successfully passed the test of death. You've entered a heavily injured state. You've entered a heavily bleeding state. Your remaining vitality will be drained quickly." A backstab. Even with Soren's extraordinary constitution of 22 points, plus the 2 points bonus from the slaughterer transformation, and the defensive effect of the stoneskin spell, he still could not reduce the enemy's damage by much. This stab directly entered a heavily injured state. Even if he temporarily passed the test of death, being stabbed in the heart meant that he would quickly enter a near-death state and eventually die. "I can't die here." This was the only thought in Soren's mind. Then, the willpower that he had been training for a long time began to show its effect. Soren suppressed the pain in his body, and also suppressed the fear of death. His brain worked quickly in an instant, and in a short moment he found a chance for himself to survive. At the same time he also found a chance to counterattack. The Sea Temple. As long as he could escape to the Sea Temple, the Naga Siren priest could heal his injury. Although this kind of fatal injury was very scary, as long as Soren could be saved from the jaws of death. The injury to the heart was completely healed, and the bleeding injury was nothing at all. As long as Soren escaped to the Sea Temple, even if his heart was destroyed, he would not die because greater restoration could even regenerate the heart. Now the Naga Siren priest would definitely not sit back and watch him die. The two sides were currently on the same front. If there was no Soren as the knife in her hand, the Naga Siren priest would eventually be alone, and her life would definitely not be better than now. Escape. He must escape from there. Only a high-grade priest could heal his fatal injury. But where would he get the chance to escape? How could the enemy in front of him let him escape? He had such a heavy injury on his body. The chance of escaping from the enemy's hands was quite low. Not to mention that there was still a long way to go from here to the Sea Temple. Fear. Instant cast. Summon Shadow. Evade sight. Shadow jump. Soren launched several abilities in a row in an instant. First, it was an instant cast of fear brought by a weak divinity, then he summoned a shadow, and then his whole person disappeared into the shadow. But this time, Soren was not trying to fight back against the enemy, but to escape from the enemy's attack. His figure appeared from a shadow in the distance, and then he instantly drank a bottle of expensive healing potion and fled in the direction of the Sea Temple. The Naga Siren priest had given him a high-grade healing potion, which could temporarily prolong Soren's death. Chapter 293. You want to run? A cold light appeared in the eyes of the legendary assassin. His figure suddenly jumped back into the shadows, but he did not enter stealth. Instead, his body directly blended into the shadows, then disappeared in the next moment, and then appeared about 30 meters ahead. This strange assassin's silhouette appeared in the shadows, but he did not stay in the same place for too long. In just a moment he disappeared again and then appeared in the shadows very close to Soren. Shadow Leap. This was a special ability that legendary rogues could master. It was similar to the effect of Shadow Leap, but they did not need to enter stealth. As long as they were in the shadows, legendary rogues could perform space jumps across planes. The effect was similar to the wizard's blink spell. This special ability belonged to the category of supernatural ability. It had a certain distance of space jumps, but there was no limit to the number of times it could be used. Under normal circumstances, legendary rogues could perform a shadow leap of up to 100 meters a day. This supernatural ability was similar to the short-distance blink spell. It could be divided into 10 meters and then used 10 times. And there was no need to enter stealth as long as the body was in the shadows. Until now. Soren's pirates finally reacted, but they were of no use in this legendary battle. By the time they were ready to rush over to help Soren, the two of them had already used their supernatural abilities to rush hundreds of meters away. The injury on Soren's back was very serious. The violent movement accelerated his blood loss. Even if he had a strong regenerative ability, he could not regenerate his heart. At this moment, a stream of blood gushed out from his back, almost dyeing his whole back red. The enemy was still gradually closing the distance. Perhaps because of the approaching death, Soren's perception ability was also pushed to the limit. He could feel that the enemy was just a dozen meters behind him, and was still catching up with him little by little. Because the enemy seemed to have some legendary item in his hand that could buff him in an instant, similar to instant escape and haste. In this case, Soren's chances of escaping were quite low, so he made a decision in an instant and rushed directly to the place where there were many people in the distance. Thump thump. After Soren's figure passed by, the crowd was in chaos for a moment, and then people and horses were thrown off their feet. The carriage in the middle of the road suddenly seemed to have gone mad, and the horses pulling the carriage neighed and rushed forward. There was a knife mark on the horse's buttocks. When Soren passed through the horse, he made a cut with his knife. Then the whole street was in chaos. Several people were sent flying by the galloping horses. No one knew if they were dead or alive after they landed on the ground, but the panicked crowd had achieved the effect Soren wanted. Soren's figure was temporarily blocked by the rushing carriages and the fleeing crowd. The enemy was slightly slower in catching up to him. Do you think you can escape like this? The eerie figure shuttled through the crowd, avoiding most of the things that were in his way. Occasionally there would be pedestrians blocking his path. A cold light would appear in his palm, and then a corpse would be left behind. Soren's injuries were too severe. Wherever he walked there would be blood stains. The enemies behind him could use this to lock onto his position, even if they had temporarily put some distance between them. Bang! Soren's figure rushed into a narrow alleyway. In just a breath's time, another eerie figure appeared and rushed into the alleyway as well. He had a playful expression on his face, like a cat trying to catch a mouse. He seemed to enjoy Soren's final struggle because he was certain that Soren would not be able to escape from his grasp. However, when he rushed into the alleyway, what he saw was not Soren's back. Instead, he saw a pair of eyes filled with murderous intent, as if they were about to strike back at him. Swoosh! When the enemy behind Soren rushed into the alleyway, a faint cold light suddenly appeared, and the enemy's figure froze for a moment. Blow dart +3. A steel needle that was almost difficult to catch with the naked eye flew out. Before the legendary assassin in front of him could react, he was hit on the spot by Soren's sudden attack. Life and death were decided in this moment. The legendary tier assassin only felt a slight pain in his body, and then he could no longer feel anything. Even though he knew that he had fallen into Soren's trap, he did not care at all. He was still prepared to kill Soren first. In his opinion, a steel needle was not enough to kill him. However, he had only taken a few steps when his body began to feel that something was wrong. His speed had obviously slowed down and his body was quite stiff when he moved. In the end, he almost staggered and fell to the ground. Damn it! The legendary tier assassin's face showed a trace of despair and panic because he found that his body was getting stiffer and stiffer. What the hell is this? It's actually so powerful. He was hit. Soren's figure turned around in an instant, and then a cold light appeared in his palm, directly striking the enemy in front of him. As a former legendary thief, Soren knew the weaknesses of rogues too well. Although rogues had all kinds of mysterious means and various special skills, they were still one thing that could not be changed. One thing that could never be changed was that they did not have as many terrible spells as wizards, and they did not have as strong resistance as warriors. Even now that Soren had accumulated 22 constitution, it was difficult for him to compare with a warrior of the same level in terms of fortitude. Therefore, if even he could not pass the +3 fortitude skill, the enemy in front of him would at most have less than a 50% chance of passing the +3 fortitude skill. Half and half. Life and death depended on whether the enemy's constitution was strong enough. In the past, when many quasi-legendary tier and legendary tier professions were exploring the outer islands, they failed miserably because of these blow darts. From the beginning, Soren planned to fight back. He wanted to bet on whether he could use the blow darts to knock down the enemy in front of him. Plop. The legendary tier assassin in front of Soren suddenly stiffened and almost fell to the ground. Such an opportunity was absolutely impossible for Soren to miss, so when the enemy in front of him lost his balance, the curved sword in his hand also drew a cold light. Sword form, beheading. Blood spurted out and a head fell to the ground, its eyes wide open. Soren's figure gasped for breath for a moment, then shook slightly as if he was a little unstable. Chapter 294. He didn't care about the corpse on the ground. Soren staggered out of the alley without looking at the legendary loot on the corpse. His vision was a little blurry and everything he saw seemed to be shaking. There seemed to be some data flashing in front of his eyes, but due to excessive blood loss, his brain began to become unclear. Soren felt more and more difficult to breathe, and the strength in his body was gradually draining away. If it weren't for a strong will supporting his body, he would have fallen down long ago. A row of data appeared, health points reduced to less than 90%. You've entered a state of near death. In a state of continuous bleeding. You will die in 30 seconds. You passed the test of death in a state of near death. You've acquired part of the special ability, Death's Toughness. Soren's vision became more and more blurry. His vitality was gradually draining away, but he was not willing to die like this. Because he couldn't die yet, and he shouldn't die in the hands of such an enemy. In the Avatar Crisis there were many legends and gods. He had experienced so many life and death killings along the way. He had even fought with the great divine power twice. Now, how could he be so easily killed by a legendary professional? He had already reached a higher level than before. As long as he was given a little time, Soren believed that he could be countless times stronger than he was at his peak in the past. Piercing his heart was depriving him of his vitality. Even the weak divinity couldn't heal Soren's injury, because this kind of injury was fatal for many high-grade demons. Unless the divinity was strong enough to ignore the body, the heart was still a fatal weakness of flesh and blood. Soren's vitality was on the verge of death. His strength was getting weaker and weaker, and his spirit was getting more and more tired. It seemed that he could fall down at any time. But he was still moving forward slowly. Everything he had experienced in the past, his will that was tempered by walking barefoot for thousands of miles, and his worry and reluctance for Vivian made him not fall down easily. Then he heard a person's voice. As if the last of his potential had been squeezed out, Soren suddenly opened his eyes. His pupils were glowing with a blood-red light, and the person who appeared in front of him seemed to be a woman. Soren could no longer see the man's face clearly, but he could feel the man's nervousness. Anyone would be shocked to see a man covered in blood walking out of an alley. The woman seemed to be an Amazon warrior. When she saw Soren, she was very alert and was ready to pull out her weapon. But at this time, Soren suddenly sped up and rushed toward her. Sorry. Soren seemed to have exhausted the last of his strength. After squeezing out all his potential, he gently said sorry, then pointed his finger at the Amazon woman who happened to appear nearby. Vampiric touch. As Soren's finger touched the woman's body, a strong vitality was transferred from the Amazon woman's body to Soren's body. The wound on his back seemed to have healed a lot, and even the pierced heart seemed to have healed a little. This was the effect of spell control. Soren was trying his best to control the vitality absorbed by the spell to transfer to the position of his heart, using it to heal the vital part of his heart that was pierced by the enemy. Soren's breathing gradually became stronger, and everything in front of him became clearer. A trace of blood even appeared on his originally pale face. He was close to death, but because of this spell he was forcibly pulled back to a seriously injured state. Even his pierced heart was still bleeding. Vampiric touch, minor divinity. When activating this talent, you can condense negative energy to erode the enemy's vitality and temporarily transfer it to yourself. After activating this ability, any enemy directly touched by you will lose, divinity plus spell power, *3 HP that you have. A maximum of 60 HP will be absorbed. These HP will be transferred to your body and heal your injuries. If the amount of HP exceeds your HP, the HP will be retained for 1 hour, increasing your maximum HP. The effect of this spell cannot be stacked. The target may die directly because of the exhaustion of vitality. This ability will increase with the level of divinity. Once per day. Bang. A cold corpse fell to the ground. As Soren's injuries gradually healed, the Amazon woman in front of him became weaker and weaker. Finally, her whole face seemed to have lost its luster, and her skin became pale and dim. Finally, she completely stopped breathing. Vampiric Touch was a necromancy spell, and it was also one of the few spells that wizards could use to heal themselves. This spell could kill the enemy. If the vitality absorbed exceeded the limit of the enemy, then the target would be completely sucked dry and die. Soren had strengthened his divinity to minor divinity. With his current divinity, casting this spell could almost achieve the maximum effect, and the Amazon woman in front of him didn't seem to have more than 60 HP. So she died. Soren said sorry before reaching out to touch her because he knew that it was difficult for people who had their vitality absorbed by him to survive. But he didn't regret it. Although this seemed to be the first time he took away an irrelevant life in order to let himself live. There was no time to think about it. The wound in Soren's heart had not completely healed. As long as it didn't heal, his vitality would continue to drain. Soren didn't look at the corpse on the ground and directly rushed in the direction of the sea temple. There was still time. After using the spell Vampiric Touch to drain the woman's vitality, Soren could at least hold on for a while. I can't die. I can't die. I can't die here. There was only one thought left in Soren's mind, that was, he couldn't die so easily because the Avatar crisis hadn't come yet, and Vivian's fate hadn't changed. If he died here, it would be difficult for the little girl to survive in the cruel battle. The obsession to live was so strong. It was so strong that Soren had nightmares all night. When he opened his eyes the next day, he found himself naked in a pool of blue sea water. In front of him was the Naga Siren priest who closed her eyes. When she noticed that Soren had woken up, she slowly opened her eyes, then raised her hand and threw a golden coin to him and said in a deep voice, "You owe me a favor. The other things on the assassin's body are my rewards. This gold coin seems to be a bit special. Only when it is close to you will there be a faint magic aura. Maybe it will be more useful for you." Chapter 295. Snap. Soren reached out and caught the gold coin. He didn't know if it was his illusion, but he seemed to feel a slight electric current. Then it seemed that there was nothing, and the gold coin in his hand became almost the same weight as the other kindlers. Soren stood up in the blue pool. He looked at his naked body, then reached out and stroked his back. He could feel the new muscles where his heart was. Without the countless guilds in the past, there were fewer and fewer high-grade priests that could be trained. In the whole South Coast area, the only high-grade priest that Soren knew was the Naga Siren priest in front of him. He didn't know what to do during the Avatar crisis. Without a high-grade priest, the casualties would be terrible. If it was in the past, he wouldn't be so embarrassed with such an injury. The priest in the team would immediately cast a restoration spell and he would be able to fight again. But now, he was forced to use Vampiric Touch to extend his life, and finally he was lucky enough to reach the Sea Temple. In the past, even when Soren was alone, he could meet some priests that were trained in other guilds from time to time. After all, priests were the core of the lineup and they were absolutely indispensable. In this way, if he was injured, he could spend more money to save him. But now he couldn't even find a priest. It was quite difficult to meet a second-grade priest outside. "I owe you a favor." Soren stood up slowly. His things were placed on the side of the hall, and it seemed that no one had touched them. However, the legendary assassin's things seemed to have been taken away by the Naga Siren priest. Soren couldn't say anything about it. After all, it was her restoration spell that saved his life. Soren was actually feeling very bad now. For the first time, he urgently found that he needed to find a priest who could cast high-grade divine spells as a teammate. Because if he didn't have such a priest by his side, it was almost impossible for him not to be injured if he encountered a powerful enemy. If he was still injured like today, even if he relied on fortitude to resist the test of death, he would still die in the hands of the enemy in the end. This time against a legendary enemy. Soren had relied entirely on luck. He had relied on the fact that the blow darts of the Aborigines had a very high degree of immunity. In the past, it had also caused some legendary professions to fail miserably. Only then did he seize the opportunity to kill the enemy. It could be said that if it weren't for the blow dart +3, Soren's chances of survival would have been quite low. After all, the enemy was a pure legendary level rogue. The disadvantages of having a part-time job were now apparent. Soren was a level 10 rogue, but he didn't even notice when the enemy had sneaked up behind him. This was the difference between pure classes and subclasses. Subclasses didn't have any obvious shortcomings, but they also couldn't develop to the limit in a certain field. Once they encountered a pure class enemy, they would be left far behind. Soren's rogue level was only half of the opponent's, and his wizard level was not enough to play a supporting role, which was why he was so passive this time. Soren got up and put on his clothes, then bowed slightly to the priest in front of the hall before leaving. Then he left the sea temple. After Soren's figure had completely left, another hazy figure appeared. It seemed to be some kind of strange sea creature. "Your Excellency." The hazy sea creature looked out of the hall and said in a hoarse voice, "Is this the new pirate king who killed the Swamp King? Didn't he make things difficult for you some time ago? Why don't you take the opportunity to kill him? It's just right to control his pirates so our power will be strengthened." The Naga Siren priest frowned, then looked at the other party coldly and said slowly, "The real value is him, not the group of trash under him. Besides, if he dies, who will help me deal with Asrid? You." Speaking of this, the Naga Siren priest's face showed a hint of sarcasm and said, "Go back. You are all good at fighting for power, but none of you really dare to fight with Asrid. In my opinion, only he can kill that damn Asrid. Pirate King Asrid. At least before getting rid of this thorn, she couldn't let Soren die like this." Moreover, on the corpse of the legendary assassin, the Naga Siren priest also saw a letter of entrustment. The contents of the letter were needless to say. After reading it, the Naga Siren priest was mad. She couldn't let Soren die like this. At the same time, she strengthened her determination to support Soren. However, this letter couldn't be shown to Soren yet. It was a very useful tool. When she was ready to kill Asrid in the future, the Naga Siren priest believed that as long as she showed this assassination letter to Soren, he would never let go of Asrid. Soren left the sea temple. Such a life and death experience made the pressure in his heart much stronger. He was also deeply aware of his own lack of strength. As time went on, the chances of legendary professions appearing would become higher and higher. Now there were already legendary assassins to assassinate him. Would the chance of meeting other legendary professions in the future be far? Legendary professions were a ticket. Without this ticket, he would not be qualified to control his own destiny in the future. Soren felt that he had too many things to do, but there was not enough time at all. It seemed that after dealing with the recent matters and laying the foundation of the base in the outer islands, it was necessary for him to go to the Underdark. This was the place Soren was most familiar with. It should also be the easiest place to reach the legendary level in the material plane. He had to go and meet those drows again. Because only in the dangerous Underdark, there were so many monsters that Soren could harvest enough slaughter EXP to reach the legendary level as soon as possible. Until Soren returned to his warship. He had time to check the data that appeared. Killing the legendary assassin gave him more than 27,000 slaughter EXP. Sure enough, it was a legendary enemy. The slaughter EXP was much higher than other enemies. Soren now accumulated about 5,000 slaughter EXP to level up as a wizard. Legendary was a watershed. Basically, killing a legendary creature would give more than 10 or 20,000 slaughter EXP. In the entire material plane, if there was a place where legendary creatures gathered the most, then the Underdark would definitely be at the top. Because there were beholders, mind flayers, drows, and all kinds of quite dangerous creatures. Because of Soren's understanding of the Underdark, it was slightly easier for him to deal with these creatures than with legendary professions. The warship soon set sail. Although Soren had just walked between life and death, he still calmly ordered to move toward Shipwreck Bay, as if the assassination yesterday did not happen at all. As for what he was thinking deep in his heart, perhaps only he knew. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.